Oh, because we were doing so much libel before, like the thing you just said about George Lucas. That
Yeah,
was
absolutely
obscene.
outrageous, especially the stuff about him and the stormtrooper. But we mustn't say more. Um, there you go.
Which kind of is that Star Wars Stormtrooper?
Yeah, Star Wars stormtrooper. Yeah, sure. Oh, there you go. Everyone can see us now. That's good. So hopefully everyone will
Awesome.
start filtering in slowly. I like how my featured video is still the one of the Eddie Marzen bit that we did.
That's great.
Yeah. Right. Everything seems to be working, so I'm just gonna. There you
Trying
go.
to get comfortable.
Yeah. Don't worry. Get comfortable. If you're in the chat, if you're already in the chat, just say hi. Let me know that you're here, because otherwise I get really nervous. As has been demonstrated with streams where Jack's meant to be on before. Oh, Gridbug, okay, Marl Cux, okay, we're good. There are people here, we're not just talking to no one. Um, so,
Hey, should I tweet something about it as
I
well?
just you can just retweet mine or tweet your own thing, yeah. It works either way. But yeah, so chat, you probably know what this is. It's Owen Jones' book, This Land, which someone in the chat whose name I've forgotten was very kind and bought for me, which means that I can now do the stream with Jack, who's been very kind and has come on again. He's always on the
Oh,
stream. We can't get rid of him.
it's just kind of gentler politics.
I think we'll be getting into some of that today. I can't even like arrange my notes because there's so many of them. So we're gonna have to go. We're gonna go chapter by chapter, everyone, because that's the only way I can make sense of any of it. Otherwise, I'm gonna be
I've
really
got
confused.
I've got 70 pages
Oh God.
of. To be fair though, that's just because it's literally all screenshots from Twitter DMs, and you can't fit more than one of them on a single page. So it's just like the best banter about this book. But no, not really banter. Just people's sincere thoughts,
Oh, as it.
including my own, that I didn't really note down outside of Twitter DMs.
Yeah, I absolutely did. There's been a lot of chatting in DMs about this book apparently that I wasn't involved in. I feel left out. I'm not in the Moon WhatsApp group that is referenced several times in this book. I don't think it is.
Yeah. I was talking with Seamus, my close personal friend, and he was just like that. Oh, and he's nah. I don't know Seamus Milne. I've never met or spoken to Seamus Milne.
We'd like to. I
Just
think. I think.
to put that out there.
I think.
Yeah, I know. I would love to.
Yeah,
Yeah, Seamus, you should come on both Real Politic and Sinan's live stream.
that's right. Seamus Milne, tell me what game you play and why it's Crusader Kings 3. Um,
He plays the game of politics. That's
yeah.
he the greatest game of all.
Anyway, yeah. Anyway, we've got some people in the chat, so I think we can. I think at the start it might help if we offer our sort of executive summary of the book. So, Jack, you have a lot of thoughts because we've been chatting. So, what's your like? If you had to summarize it, what would your summary be for this book?
Oh God! Wow. Should we do that more towards the end? I don't. I mean, I don't know. No, it's just. I mean,
We can leave it till the end because it might make more sense. Because I know what kind of thing we're both going to say, and it might make more sense if we go chapter by chapter to walk through it.
yeah. I mean, yeah. Should we? I mean, we can talk about like what. Yeah, I guess we can. I guess we can sort of like say like what the book is, like in case anyone hasn't like followed the saga.
Yeah,
Like, just try and give as like objective a summary as we can. So this is like, so obviously like a month or two maybe now ago, Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogren from The Times put out their book Left Out. Sorry, it's just there's so many books about the left that have names like it, despite having done literally 3 episodes of it on my podcast. I fucking forgot the name there. But yeah, like that book is a kind of based on a massive variety of sources. It's just a kind of like gossipy insider account of the Corbyn years. And I actually like, I was obviously prejudiced heavily against the book because it's written by two guys from the Times, and I thought it was going to be just a full-on hatchet job. But I think that there are elements of that to left out, but there's also some genuinely useful stuff in there. For example, they're very well connected, not only with the left, but with the right of the Labour Party. So you get a lot more of the inside track on like what the right were doing to undermine Jeremy Corbyn throughout his time as Labour leader in that one, and stuff about the Change UK plotters and so on. There's some useful stuff in that, but I suppose what Owen Jones has done is he's said, well, we can't leave the story of the last few years up to these two guys who write for the Murdoch Times. So he's said, okay, I'm gonna tell it how I saw it. And yeah, I mean, yeah. So I guess I think so. The book is essentially like a highly subjective account of the last few years from someone who was sort of on the inside, but also sort of not, of the Corbyn project, rather. Do you think that sounds right?
That's about right, yeah. I would say that for Left Out, I kind of relegate it to historical fiction, almost, because of how much of it was just so easily disproven by publicly available information.
Yeah, there were a few gaping holes in that.
Yes,
not least the mere 7 mentions of Mike Gapes. I don't even think he appeared at all in in the Owen Jones book. So, but let's not let that. That sounds like I'm already getting into slagging off a book. No mentions of Mike Gapes. Outrageous.
It's absolutely disrespectful to not mention Iron Mike, I think. We can all agree. But I suppose he wasn't really relevant to the perspective that Owen was trying to put out there. So, because his sources are very clearly on the left of the party. There's like some bits where he talks to like unnamed people from the right of the party who just sort of probably just wanted to give him a bit more of a complete picture. But
yeah, who does he talk? He talks to, I think, Gloria De Piero from a right of the party, who goes on record, who lost her seat at the last general election. Or no, I think she stepped down, actually. Maybe her seat was lost, but she didn't run.
Her seat was lost because it's just north of me. It's very unfortunate. But there's also there's that interesting bit about her, essentially her safe space being Jeremy Corbyn's advisors, because the Remainers in the party were so ridiculous and absurd.
Yeah. The Great Milne and also like Ian Lavery and
yeah,
so
Ian.
on.
Yeah, he features. We'll get to that. There's I made notes of like the coolest shit that people did. So half my notes are like king shit.
Yes. So... Yeah. No, I'm looking forward to getting into some of like, because there are like, to Owen's credit, there are some like fun anecdotes in here. Like if you want the gossip, this book does have some of that.
And in fairness, it's better written than Left Out. So I'm just going to be fair to Owen again. Like, it's not poorly written, and there was only one typo that I could see. So what can not?
I think there are some flaws. They're in the writing. Certain like omissions and certain things like that he'll just repeat. Like he'll do a thing where he'll explain who someone is and then mention somebody else and not explain who they are, but he's already explained who the person who he just explained is on a previous page very recently. Just that kind of thing, not like egregious stuff.
Yeah, it's not...
I feel a bit petty bringing that up, actually.
Yeah, but it's fine. It's a fine book. He's written it fine. It's alright, like just speaking as it wasn't a difficult read. I didn't have to power through it in 2 days just to kind of blunt the trauma. It was fine. But he does set out some of the terms on which he'd probably like this to be judged in the introduction, which is that he states that he wants to dispel the two core myths about why Corbynism essentially hit a brick wall, which is like the centrist myth, which is that he was fundamentally illegitimate and ill-suited and therefore the failure of the project is just a sign that the left can never ever participate fully in democratic politics in this country ever. And then there's the other one, which is the narrative that we might all be a bit more familiar with, which was that the Corbyn project was the victim of, sabotage that it could simply never surmount, and that there was nothing we could have done.
Yeah, that myth.
Yeah, well, I'm framing
Sorry, I'm
it how
giving
he
the game
puts
away
it.
here.
Yeah,
Spoilers.
yeah, spoilers. Thank you for the follow, Frick Shamer. I like that name. If you have a nice name, I'll call it out. But he sets out that that's one of the things that he wants to do, and I'm gonna kind of spoil it. I don't think he really quite manages to do either. It seems like he kind of veers. I think that's actually an interesting thing to write about, but he seems to veer off during it into other topics, as he should. And
I felt, I got a bad vibe in that early bit where he kind of put. I think the example he cited was people who say shit like Corbyn was the handmaiden of Brexit, which was like what David Miliband, I think I remember saying, and it was a very popular phrase among Remainers and stuff. And I was just thinking, well, in terms of David Miliband, I'd rather be the handmaiden of Brexit than the handmaiden of fucking CIA torturers. But I mean, like, Owen basically puts that kind of mad thing on the same level. That kind of ridiculous thing on the same level as, like, just thinking that really the odds were just incredibly stacked against Jeremy Corbyn and the left, and that that there was just an incredible amount of sabotage and things that just basically did make it untenable, whatever the like competence or the flaws of the people on in the Corbyn operation.
Yeah, and there's also a bit where he says that he wants to kind of make it look like it's not impossible for left politics to succeed, but his conclusion seems to be that it kind of is. I don't know that he successfully makes that case in this either.
Well, yeah, because I don't really. Yeah, I don't see a good alternative, as to how politics can succeed, and you can argue that like the onus is not on one man, on a journalist like Owen Jones to, come up with like the winning formula for the left. But at the same time, like, what is this book? Is it a history book that kind of details what happened in the last few years, or is it a strategy book that kind of tells the left what they should have been doing instead? And it does seem a little bit muddled in that regard, I think.
Yeah, I think he gets trapped between the two at times. The first few chapters are fine, which we'll talk about now. I think we'll just start getting into them. Because the first few chapters are essentially fine. There are like a couple of small things where we're like, I mean, I'm not sure that's exactly what it was, but it's also largely... So the first one is before Corbyn. So he's talking about... He's going from 1997 up until 2015 in this chapter, if I remember correctly. And it's largely a factual account of that time period, I think. There wasn't really... The one thing that struck me was like how little Labour has fundamentally changed since like Tony Benn and stuff, like, because there's this passage here with Labour rules making it difficult to unseat incumbents. The local party was moribund and it did its best to keep newcomers out. That speaks true to my experience.
Yeah, that's very familiar.
Yeah. And so, my note here is Labour fundamentally hasn't changed. I'm not kind in my notes. Not about Owen, but just about the stuff that he talks about, I think.
Yeah.
But, it is largely, in the first chapter, a factual account of the events that preceded Corbyn. And he does note that he worked for John McDonnell, which was not something that everyone's aware of, I don't think, which is that he did work for John McDonnell, which...
No, but I think that's something you have to bear in mind throughout the rest of the book.
Yeah, I suspect it informs an element of the perspective here, which is not necessarily about... He's upfront about it, to be fair. He's not hidden it from anyone. He's not tried to trick you.
Well, he talks as well. He when he's in the little bit about how he worked for McDonnell before the Corbyn era. He also introduces another key character in the book, who is Andrew Fisher, who would go on to be one of Corbyn's key aides, who wrote the 2017 and 2019 manifestos, and who Owen regards very highly. And like, it's quite fun. Whenever he's introduced, it's always like the eternally fresh-faced Andrew Fisher, the frighteningly competent Andrew Fisher. But there's a few things like that where, like, Owen's mates get like just showered in superlatives, and then it will mention something like, it's like the charismatic and young MP Clive Lewis, and also Richard Bergen.
Yeah, I didn't. He described Richard Bergen as a telegenic, and I'm like, I don't think so.
No, it was Clive Lewis.
Oh, it was Clive Lewis. Yeah, he described him as handsome, actually. Which, I mean, fair enough. I'm not saying anything about anyone's taste.
In different bits about Lewis.
Yeah, I know that someone asked what's the best bit of the book. We will get to that at the end, I think. End participation. Was Andrew Fisher not the guy who once got drummed out for telling people to vote class war or something? I'm not sure.
That was Andrew Fisher. Yeah, that was really funny because the candidate was Emily Benn, Tony Benn's Melt granddaughter, who's the daughter of that Nita Clark woman who Keir Starmer tried to hire, and then people unearthed her right-wing views, and she was unhired within the day, just very recently. And then her father is Tony Benn's son, who took the hereditary title that Tony Benn had renounced. So real Melt family there. And Andrew Fisher, I think, joked that people should vote for class war instead of Emily Benn, the Labour candidate.
Yeah, I also want to say it's pretty funny to get Visyud out of the job. And in this case, it was well deserved, I think. Unlike the time I got Visyud out of the job.
Did you?
Well, we'll talk about it maybe another time. I basically did. It was because of the stream.
Great.
Which is pretty funny. I think that means I've made it. But anyway, that's probably not a good thing to have on the VOD. It was not anything controversial, I don't think, what I said. Mostly. Controversial in some circles, let's say. But yeah, most of it, in the first chapter, he goes into working with McDonnell. He describes, what the state of their offices were like, because they were left-wing MPs. They were not in the mainstream of the party. So they had small staff. It was all a mess. He does return to this, which is that Corbyn is famously disorganised, which...
Yeah, he makes the point of being like, McDonnell's operation was highly efficient, Andrew Fisher was great, Corbyn's was a fucking mess. Which is probably true, man, I don't know.
Yeah, I kind of buy this, and also, can I just say, this stream is a smooth-running operation. It does not... It's perfectly run, very well organised.
Not lacking in organizational capacity.
That's right. And it goes on. It talks about when John McDonnell ran for Labour leader that one time in 2007, which he obviously didn't get nominated. Which of course,
the problem was Labour MPs all thought he was a cunt, and he all thought they were cunts.
Which, by the way, fair enough. I mean, not like about John, but necessarily. I mean about the PLP, wider PLP.
Well, for those of us who are right now advocating a very aggressive stance against the Starmer right-wing ideological project, hearing Owen's account of John McDonnell's resolute contempt for the majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party is quite heartening, really, because pre-2015 or pre-2017-18 John McDonnell, maybe Labour's great lost leader, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, we discussed this in DMs about which McDonnell we think was the great lost leader and which wasn't. But yeah, so he talks about, the team is Andrew Fisher and him, and he then goes into the financial crash, which obviously springs out all of these social movements and protest movements, and people start, oh, well, I'm glad you're not lurking anymore, Gammonus, which I'm assuming I'm pronouncing right. I love everyone's name. Everyone's name in the chat is fantastic, because I have to read them out. But I'm glad you're not lurking anymore. And people are saying that Jeremy Corbyn has a uni lecturer with a massive pile of papers vibe. Yes, he does. That's the
Yeah.
common. He was literally a geography teacher, to be fair, but that's not mentioned in the book at all because it's not a biography of Corbyn. But I also
I'm
did.
trying to get. Sorry, if people see me shifting awkwardly, I'm just trying to get an angle where like the light isn't reflecting off my glasses because I feel really self-conscious that I don't have any eyes in the shot.
I need a ring light because I look like a Sith Lord at some angles with my living room light just blaring down on top of me. And yeah, so
this is impossible. Whatever. Let's people have to deal with.
everyone will have to live with it. I'm afraid. I do like the Lib Dems, a so-called centrist party. I don't know if they identified as a centrist party before 2010 explicitly, but yeah, you know.
Yeah, I guess they're pretty centrist at their core.
Yeah, and he talks about the student protests. It's not a bad chapter. It is largely factual, quite interesting. It does give you a clue as to what perspective is going to inform his analysis as we go through, because it's just kind of clear that he regards the people he worked with in John McDonnell's office very highly, which is fair enough. Like, I have colleagues that I regard very highly, and I would, if I wrote a book about them, I'd be very nice. But you know,
yeah. But I mean, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I think what's notable about the first chapter is that it is actually grounded in movements, in social movements, in protests, on the streets, in occupations, and that is unfortunately one of the flaws in the book. Is that it is just far too focused on like the court of Corbyn. So the contextual bit, the way that Owen gives you a portrait of, say, like the student protests and anti-globalization protests, anti-war protests, that's the kind of thing that's lacking from the analysis of the Corbyn years in this book.
Yeah, but he does do it for the Blair up to Miliband years quite effectively, I would say. And then the second chapter is basically him telling us the tale of how much of a clusterfuck Ed Miliband's leadership was, and how he wasn't a terrible melt until he basically got bullied into it by his shadow cabinet and the PLP, and he melted horribly, and that resulted in a terrible defeat. Well, in fact,
slightly revisionist, I think. If we're going to give it both barrels to Corbyn for the flaws in his leadership, then I think Ed Miliband deserves far more opprobrium from a left-wing perspective for his.
Yeah.
But it's true. Owen is very critical of a lot of what Ed Miliband's leadership actually was in form. I just think people keep kind of pinning strangely after his leadership. When we have a far better alternative, we don't anymore, but people still to this day keep pinning a lot of hopes on Ed Miliband in a way that I think is misguided, because for all his virtues, he is still very much from that New Labour tradition.
Yeah, I think Ed Miliband... I still think of Ed Miliband what I thought of him in 2015, which is that he's probably quite a nice guy, but what a shame that he doesn't have the guts to actually stand for what he probably believes in. If he had a bit more gut, a bit more guts, I probably would have voted Labour in 2015, but I did not. Yeah. So there you go. That's something no one knew about me. Oh, that's me out of the party if I hadn't already left. Although there's actually a bit about that whole operation in this.
I'm still a member. I'm not a people should leave Labour person really, but I have a different perspective from say Owen Jones on what being in the Labour Party on the left at the moment should be.
Yeah, it was not the Lib Dems, before anyone asks. My red line was not being pro-austerity, which, by the way, to Owen's credit, he describes Ed Miliband's policies accurately as austerity light. So there you go. And he talks about the aftermath of the 2015 election and how there was this big, deep pit of despair for the left, and it is the darkest moment of the left since 1951, according to McDonnell, was one quote that stuck out. And how it was all over, and just a complete nightmare. In fact, I just went by the quote in my copy of the book.
Mm. Yeah, no, I mean, well, it was a very bad time. The party establishment obviously wanted to move the party pretty drastically to the right, even of what the party had been under Ed Miliband, and I think probably to the right of what it had been under Blair and Brown as well, actually, because politics in the country had only shifted rightward since then, and they were basically saying, "We'll do what is considered mainstream at the moment," which at that point was like David Cameron conservatism.
Yeah, I think the I'm trying to think what the best way to put it is. I think the thing is they want to make the Blairite bargain, but the price of the Blairite bargain is much higher now than it was when Blair did it. So you would probably have to move much further to the right to actually succeed in Blair's weird Faustian bargain that he made with Rupert Murdoch and so on.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, that's why it's so like disgusting to see like, leading people from Starmer's Labour, including Starmer himself, trying to court the Murdoch press. Not just the Times, although obviously people in the Corbyn movement briefed the fucking shit out of the Times, but like, like the Sun as well, vile, and it's misguided. It's not going to work.
Yeah, like you shouldn't write in the Sun anyway if you're a person with any ethics or principles.
Yeah,
just as a general position that I'm going to take on it. He does mention that he wanted Lisa Nandy to be the candidate of the left in 2015, which I kind of give him a pass, maybe. Like,
well, it's true that people didn't know that she was as right wing as she is now. Then, but at the same time, like, I think that is a classic kind of Owen wanting to take the path of least resistance when other people on the left were saying, what if John gives it another go? What if we run Jeremy Corbyn? Blah blah blah. There were other people who were kind of actually left wing who I think like people kind of. Some people maybe tried to urge John Trickett to run. I don't know. Various.
Yeah, I think he goes into the various suggestions that came up and how it's the same in every retelling of the story, which is like, what about Jeremy? Because no one hates him, which is quite a strange thing to hear these days. But
yeah. No, I missed that.
In every retelling of the story, it's that they're sort of talking about Diane Abbott and John McDonnell and these other characters that are sort of were not even prominent under Corbyn, and then they're like, well, what about Jeremy? Oh, wait, we can run someone who people don't dislike? Wow.
Yeah.
Why didn't I think of that? I know it sounds obvious now to do it, but, like, obviously, Jeremy Corbyn gave no indication of wanting to be leader, and that's a point that he makes, which is that Jeremy Corbyn he ran out of a sense of duty rather than to win.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, pedantic little point. I don't know if Owen says this in the book, but in the interview with Prospect that I listened to today, that they did on their podcast, like Owen said that Jeremy had never even aspired to front bench experience, but I think he had actually run to be, when they used to elect the shadow cabinet. Corbyn ran to be shadow foreign secretary, and he came like dead last out of all the MPs who'd gone for that position. So presumably behind some like absolute cunts. In fact, one of them probably won the position. But yeah, I mean, he actually had thought of, he'd considered running for deputy leader as well, I think in 2007, but he ended up supporting Hilary Benn in a misguided bit of loyalty to Hillary's dad. But,
Yeah,
that's Jeremy, you're very loyal.
Yeah, in fact, that does come up quite a bit as a weakness more than a strength in the way that Owen puts it. But
yeah.
Okay, so he talks about Lisa Nandy. I'm trying to think what was the other interesting thing in this chapter, but I've completely forgotten about what it was.
Well, something I thought was unnecessary was the insinuation that Corbyn had some kind of breakdown in 2015. I just thought it was a bit unseemly. I don't know where he sourced it from, but it just seems like the kind of thing that I wouldn't want to get into. It just seemed like kicking a man when he was down, putting that in there, to be honest.
And we do have a question, which is, how do you think the cursed long 90s contributed to Labour's weaknesses, and does the book address this? He does talk about how the Labour Party was the victim of forces that were born in the 90s, essentially, like the long-term decline in Leave voting seats. And so it does address it briefly. I don't think he goes too deep into it because that's not in the specific remit of what he wanted to try and do here.
He does in the conclusion as well, right at the end of the book. He talks about how New Labour contributed a lot to the kind of gradual waning of Labour support in those kind of seats that Labour lost at the last election.
Yeah, there was actually, I just remembered one of the interesting bits in which was, it's just sort of interesting because I remember this very clearly because it was probably the moment where I may have put a bet on Jeremy Corbyn at 200-1. We're not going to go too deep into that, but it was the Nuneaton debate where Jeremy Corbyn absolutely just slaughtered all of the other contestants, basically, all of the other competitors, and it's written pretty much in those terms where he just absolutely bodied everyone, and even the audience there had voted in Nuneaton, because it was an audience made up of former Labour voters who just sort of defected from the party to various parties. He'd won 44% of the room, which were not Labour members, by the way. That was just the crowd they picked up in Nuneaton. So that tells you how effective he was back then.
At the start, Corbyn actually did have like broad cross-party appeal. That was one of the arguments for him. It was that once the kind of like the partisan smear machine really kicked in against him, then his appeal started to really just kind of like focus around the traditional left. But at the start, like, you know, Corbyn was really actually like, everyone was saying about those debates, even people who didn't like his politics, like, he's the only one who comes across as honest and sincere.
Yeah, there was also the that I remember the polling from the time because I was a terrible nerd, even though I wasn't posting on Twitter. That was like, does he make you more or less likely to vote for Labour? And he was smashing it with more across every single partisan demographic group that you could think of. He was net more in every single voting group in the country, which I suppose came out as true in the 2017 election. That sort of came true there, where he did increase Labour's support pretty much in every group except over 65s.
Mm.
Does Owen mention his own melting on Corbyn prior to the 2017 election? He does gently refer to it.
Yeah, he does a bit, but I think, again, there are careful omissions in how he depicts it, which we can maybe get into when those chapters arrive, as that's the kind of format we're doing.
Yeah, but I think this is the second chapter, the one where he goes all the way up to him winning the leadership. And about the great... I think he's the first person to use self-own in one of these books, so credit where it's due to Owen for using self-own, which was the one member, one vote thing being the biggest self-own in political history.
Yeah, he did a bit of the Falkirk thing. Again, like, so I've said to you that the first 3 chapters of the book, I think it is, it may be like the first 4, or I can't remember exactly how he structured it, because I only had an audiobook copy and I asked around but couldn't get a PDF. A New Socialist couldn't get a review copy of this, so I was like, fuck, I bet I couldn't independently. Anyway, like, those early chapters are both my favorite bit of the book, and also I think an inferior account of those events to Alex Nuns' excellent The Candidate, which is the best book that has been written on Corbynism still.
I highly recommend it. I've read it. It was very good.
I really hope Alex has got one that will cover the period after which his candidate stops. At the very if not an updated candidate, then a whole,
because he's already updated it once to include 2017.
So exactly.
I remember that video where it was like, how could they all get it so wrong? for the updated version, I really like that. But yeah, this chapter is largely, it's not anything new. I didn't notice anything new in this particular chapter. He goes through the story about the welfare bill where everyone melted except about 40 MPs, which probably did effectively seal the leadership for Corbyn. If we were being honest, that was the moment where it was game over, at least probably for a first round win. But he does start to kind of get into the what he gets onto later, which is that there's elements of dysfunction and unpreparedness a little bit here, I think. But
Yeah.
obviously they didn't expect to win, so this is not the least understandable bit of dysfunction that you might expect.
No, I mean, really, it is just this is where I think the you know the book this analysis about the incompetence almost kind of just discounts how frankly unfathomable it is to have a figure of the radical left be the leader of a major social democratic party that is the second party in its country with the potential to become the first. It's there is really nothing like it, nothing like Corbynism that has happened, and you honestly can't take that for granted. That factors into everything about it, and the fact is there just wasn't a huge wealth of people on the left with prior experience of kind of like political management, media management, that kind of thing. Because the left had been shut out for so long, there were some people who'd kind of slipped through the cracks, but very few, frankly. And that is extremely hard to overcome because you're not going to train an entire left wing workforce in 5 years.
Yeah, and it does raise some questions when an entire legitimate political tendency is shut out of these opportunities.
Yeah.
It does raise some questions about the state of the democracy that the country is in.
Yeah.
Really, actually, I didn't quite get there, write that in my notes, but it does institutionally raise questions. And I don't know that we solved this problem in the past 5 years. We don't have. I said it to Jack in DMs. The left does not have a deep bench. We don't have a deep bench of talent, and we don't have many people with experience because we just have never been in these positions before. And I think that's probably a good point to move on to chapter 3 because it's the start of the Corbyn leadership. And there's an anecdote in here that I didn't know about the specifics of it. I did know there was no one to sort of do the handover bit for Corbyn's team. I didn't know they had to literally break the door into the office, which was kind of a funny. This is one of those good anecdotes that he does put in, which is that I'm trying to remember who it was because I'm near the bit. It was Angie Williams had to shoulder barge the door open into the office. Just she did it to avoid losing face in front of the new boss, which I'm like, I don't think he would have minded that much, but there you are. Yeah, my note here is literally kind of funny.
Well, yeah, no, it is, but yeah, so I guess so this section covers the early part of the Corbyn leadership. And I think there's a lot in this bit about the sabotage of Corbyn from within, the way that, Owen writes that Angela Eagle, who he himself had previously advocated to be Shadow Chancellor instead of John McDonnell, in an ironic twist of fate. But no, she was Labour's shadow business and industry secretary or whatever, and she had blocked, because obviously Corbyn's shadow cabinet at that point was dominated by the right. You had she basically with her allies in the shadow cabinet was able to block the Labour's advocacy of the nationalisation of the steelworks during the Port Talbot and Redcar crises, and she and eventually, the way Owen tells it, Anna Soubry on the Tory benches, who I think at that point served in, she was at Eagle's opposite number.
Yeah.
But apparently Angela Eagle at that point, once a Tory had said it, was like, yeah, okay, we can nationalise it, fine.
Yeah, which I think is telling. It tells you about the political instincts of that particular section of the party, which is that they seem desperate to cling on to the Tories as closely as possible.
Yeah.
He also does actually mention that the press behave like partisan extensions of the Tories. He does mention it. I don't know that he follows through on that analysis at any point, but he does mention it briefly, so he's at least acknowledged the obvious truth, which is that the press in the UK do have a partisan bias. But I don't know.
They do.
I don't know that he mentions his his employer once though.
Yeah.
But, you know,
Okay. So this is what I'm saying. Throughout the book, there are a number of careful omissions that bolster any of Owen's given arguments at any one time. So, for example, when he's talking about what Labour members were disillusioned with, when he's reeling off, it may just be as trivial as that things sound good in threes. But he lists a few things like the Labour's stance on welfare, immigration, and economics or something. And, foreign policy is in there nowhere. Whereas obviously, people did feel that the members did feel that the Labour Party was like enthralled to warmongers pre-Corbyn, and that was one of the reasons that people gravitated towards him, his anti-war record that was later weaponized against him. And I think that although Owen does mention that when it comes up in his kind of chronological narrative later on, it's not as convenient to the argument that he's making as the like bread and butter economic stuff, which again fits in with this kind of I guess McDonnell-like strategy that we can get into as it goes on. But this is really the most glaring and I think frankly dishonest omission. So there's a long bit, fairly long actually, where he talks about the way that Corbyn was systematically undermined and delegitimized by the British media and press.
Yeah.
Now, he talks about the right-wing press, the Daily Mail, the Sun, the Times, blah, 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 all the usual suspect. And he talks about the BBC as well, because now, obviously, it's okay to criticize the BBC if you're on the left now, because they're so flagrantly biased in a rightward direction. But what he does not mention is the systematic delegitimization of Corbyn and of left-wing politics and of the Labour membership, who I was really hoping for a more full-throated defense of in this book, to be honest, the movement themselves. That is completely elided. The work of The Guardian, The Observer, obviously the former being Owen's employer, not only them, but the New Statesman and The Independent and its various adjunct publications as well. But, none of that comes up, which is just astonishing, because these publications, what they did was they poisoned people who would otherwise be inclined to support Corbyn on the basis of what he really is. It's his perception of him and of the left and of the movement. Bit by bit, systematically, you cannot look at the Corbyn era and how it was undermined by, just this spreading of these spurious narratives in the press without a heavy focus on, again, all of this stuff has been covered so much better by Alex Nuns in The Candidate, where he lists this, there was a day when all of The Guardian's columnists had to go against Corbyn, apart from Owen, obviously, and a couple of others, but almost all of them just were wheeled out. Even fucking arseholes like Jonathan Jones, who's an art critic, he was brought out to fucking have a go at Corbyn. It was just absolutely systematic what they did. And you can say, okay, they supported Labour at the elections when it came down to it. Yeah, they did, but in the most kind of like equivocal way. And, that was probably, because they almost felt they couldn't not. They thought it would be a step too far to say, well, actually, we don't want the only alternative to a Tory government, with for their readership. But I think they did everything they could. There was a poll conducted by The Guardian of their readers in early 2016 when they had been absolutely just slating Corbyn for almost a year, and about 71% of The Guardian's readers thought he was doing a good job. And it took them years to turn their own readers against the policies that they wanted and needed, and turned them away from solutions that would address the social issues that some of The Guardian's excellent reporting has shown people the reality of. it was a disgusting posture by the paper during the Corbyn era, and you have to wonder, how Owen thinks he can get away with not even addressing it at all.
Yeah, I was going to say the Guardian's 2019 endorsement was basically the New Statesman's fence sitting, but they were like, I guess you should vote against the Tories because we can't really credibly say otherwise, because otherwise we will get played.
And without the good bit about capitalist realism that George Eaton 100% wrote.
Yeah,
all right, George, you can have your paragraph.
George follows me on Twitter, so I think he's good now again.
No, he's a great guy. I unironically love George Eaton.
Anyone who follows me gets good. It's basically like the model of the book, the way I describe people. If you follow me on Twitter, I'm going to say nice things about you. Owen Jones does follow me on Twitter, so I do.
Does he?
Yeah, but I do say nice things. And we have been nice so far.
On my old account, I was mutuals with Owen for a long time. And I don't know, maybe should we take a minute to say, what is our history with Owen Jones? Have you been following his work for a long time?
Yeah, before I was online, very online and very left-wing online, it was, the way he described Seamus Milne as the lone island of resistance to the end of history. Owen Jones is almost like that for me when I was much younger, when I was 21, 20.
Yeah.
It was like that, and which is why I'm kind of chuffed that he follows me, even though I'm doing this review where we're kind of being a bit more critical than perhaps some people would like, or not as critical as some people in the chat would like. But it's
well, I just went off for ages about how he didn't include anything about the Guardian, and I've got more shit like that if that's what people want. But yeah,
it does strike me as strange. I do wonder if it's he's apparently contractually obligated not to attack the Guardian, so I wonder if that factored into it.
Well, he talks about not taking not taking an advisory position with Corbyn because he felt that would compromise his journalistic impartiality. I think it fucking compromises your journalistic impartiality to write a book about a narrative in which, like it or not, your employer was a major actor, and just not address their role for your own professional advantage.
Oh, Discord did the thing. All right, hold on, everyone. Sorry, Jack. Discord did the thing. Sorry, Jack. Discord did the thing.
Oh yeah. Oh dear. Hang on. Oh, let me get my camera back on.
You get to see the Seamus Milne bit that I had prepared for this, everyone. So there you go.
Sorry. What was I saying?
You were talking about journalistic integrity when Owen talks about his journalistic integrity being compromised by taking a position with Corbyn.
Yeah, I'm going to say I think I wouldn't have had, because I think actually Owen's got a lot of good points as one of many voices advising Corbyn. I think he could have potentially been a good influence. I not replacing Seamus Milne or anything, but just as one person in a kind of part-time role. And if he was open about that, I don't think that would have been too egregious. But I think that the kind of just writing the Guardian out of the story thing is quite egregious.
Yeah, I was gonna say because I hadn't read the entire thing by that point. That's quite the bit about Seamus Milne. The bit about. I'm just thinking of the bit that I had behind the capture of Discord again. I hope everyone enjoyed that. By the way, that was Jack's suggestion. So I put the "they don't understand why they're hated" headline behind our thing in case it crashed.
That's great.
But I was going to say that, at the start, I think my note there is actually that's kind of remarkably principled. But given how, he notes that the British press in general is a partisan force, that maybe that was not the wisest decision. I think because, if the British press is a partisan force anyway, I get that you want to be principled, and it is a principled position to say, look, I'm a journalist, I have to report on things, I have to talk about things, I need distance from the subject. Makes sense. But if the rest of the British press is basically embedded in Tory HQ's press office, I don't know that there's any great merit to that beyond just sort of feeling good about what you're doing.
Well, I mean, that is, I think, the essentially the problem with the book is that Owen kind of he's torn between being somebody who has a certain distance from a project and who feels that he should maintain a certain distance from a project, and and simultaneously, being just just because the left is only so big in Britain, and the people who are like on the left may have jobs where they do kind of left-wing things, is an even smaller pool of people. Like Owen just like already knew like all the people in the Corbyn movement. He was part of it, whether he liked it or not. He was in there. But there always did seem to be a tug of war between him being an insider or an outsider to the Corbyn project and to the world of journalism. He never quite fit into either because of that conflict. Which, yeah, I don't know. I think it's just interesting that, yeah, he didn't, especially in those early days, he didn't really seem sure how to kind of like reconcile that. I mean, maybe I should say, because I said maybe we should talk about like our history with Owen Jones and that. Like, I've kind of gone through like a few like periods of different attitudes to Owen. Like before Corbyn, and in the early days of Corbyn, he was like somebody I really liked. He kind of went up there and put forth ideas that actually made sense to me in a world, in a media sphere where nobody fucking did that, apart from, I read Seamus Milne as well. For example, before Corbyn, I was a big fan. So I always had a lot of respect for Owen. I went off him, shall we say, in 2016 to 17 when he had his well-documented, although, not so well-documented in this book, actually, kind of wobble with Corbyn. But then after 2017, I really did feel I thought that Corbynism should like take a big tent approach, and I really felt we should forgive Owen because he's an important voice on the left, and for me then at that point, could it be quite frank, he became a kind of heroic figure because he was always just and it's probably not very fun for him, but he was always just getting into these positions where he was like the lone voice of almost like it was before Corbyn in the world of the media. He was like the lone person who would be speaking out like and saying something fucking ridiculous is fucking ridiculous, and then every fucking one of his peers practically would just be ganging up on him and giving him shit. And as somebody within the media who was prepared to make criticisms of the media, I began to really respect that about him. And obviously, I respect other things as well, how he stands up to fascists and transphobes, often at great personal cost. And I think he's one of the few people in this country who probably can, on some level, relate to the kind of attacks and vilification that Jeremy Corbyn has received. Although I think that almost leads him to take a less sympathetic attitude to Jeremy Corbyn than some people.
It does feel a bit like, if I've been there and I've managed to get through it, maybe someone else should be able to get through it as well. You know, it does feel like that attitude. But he does, in this chapter, he does go into, we're still on chapter 3, we've got a long way to go apparently. This is a lot of there's a lot of stuff in here. But he does talk about the internal sabotage that the Corbyn project faced, and he does identify it correctly as a reason why the project failed.
Yeah. It absolutely is. But is chapter 3 also where he gets into the coup in 2016?
And just having a look.
His own misgivings about the Corbyn project.
No, but I did highlight one bit where apparently, I didn't know this anecdote, an MP screamed at Richard Burgon that he was a cunt, so that was one that I felt...
Yeah!
I didn't know that anecdote, so if you wanted to hear about that, I mean, I feel like that MP... And my note here is abuse in politics, question mark.
Richard Burgon gets a really hard lot, I think. People are really horrible about him a lot of the time. which is a shame because I think he's a great guy, but yeah,
he uses these incidents that did happen, which was to sort of explain why a bunker mentality developed around the leader of the opposition's office. Because obviously, if your own MPs are screaming at you that you're a cunt, then you are obviously going to withdraw a little bit into your staff, who you would hope are broadly on your side. I think and he does acknowledge it. He does acknowledge that it's understandable, and he doesn't read into that bit, and he doesn't read as unsympathetic in that part.
No.
He does mention like some great lost titans of the past, like Simon Danchuk, who got brutally owned in 2017. Much to my joy.
Oh, yeah, Simon Danchuk, who, as Owen points out, was suspended from the party later for sexting a 17-year-old.
Allegedly. As he says
no, that fucking totally happened. Oh, right, allegedly. Oh, sorry if Owen said that. Yeah, it was alleged. What else? There's the story about Tristram Hunt, isn't there?
Yeah.
Where he, living up to his Cockney rhyming slang surname, he goes up to, I think, is it Cat Fletcher, who was working for Corbyn at the time, and he just grabs the lanyard from around her neck, which when you surely grabbing a lanyard from around a woman's neck could basically looks like a sexual assault. It looks like you're lunging for their tits.
But
surely that would be a really intimidating thing to do.
Oh, it's definitely intimidating. I'm not.
That's horrible.
Yeah, it's definitely not professional
just
conduct.
Think about it. but yeah, he goes up, he lunges for and grabs it, just looks at it, and then, as Owen describes it, just sneers and walks off. I don't know if that means he just went ugh.
Oh no, he says, "Oh, you won't be here long," and then walks off because she's a member of Corbyn's staff. And then he does acknowledge that the first shadow cabinet Corbyn had was a broad spectrum of the Labour Party. I think that's often forgotten in mainstream coverage, which is that he tried to make it work with these fuckers. Honestly, I don't know anyone who would have dealt with these people as long as Corbyn. If it was me, I'd have fucking crammed in all my mates, experience or not. Maybe that meant I would have got cooed sooner and just got brutally rinsed later. But I know there weren't many. There's not a deep bench, but still, he only had two of his allies in the shadow cabinet, in the first shadow cabinet, which was McDonnell and Diane Abbott. Oh, and John Trickett, excuse me. So he had three.
Yeah. The Trickett's an interesting character, because he used to be what the soft left was. Now the soft left just means you like redistributed policies, but you also think that solidarity with Middle Easterners is anti-white racism.
Yeah, it does go into the coup, because it goes into Hilary Benn's factually inaccurate and terrible speech that he gave, and no one ever acknowledges that it's ahistorical. The way he described it is ahistorical. Invoking the spirit of the international brigades to justify bombing Syria is ahistorical bullshit, and people should call him out on it. Anyway, this is one thing that I got angry about at the time, and I'm still angry about now.
Definitely, and I earlier on I criticised Owen Jones for sometimes eliding the foreign policy element of the anti-Corbyn thing in his arguments, but this does get an extensive write-up where he begins to address the Hilary Benn speech in Parliament in 2015.
He also, to be fair, I remember this quote very clearly, does specifically say that part of the reason why his MPs thought he was illegitimate was because of his foreign policy views.
Yeah,
he does specifically call it out.
He doesn't leave it out of the book. He leaves it out of certain sections where it doesn't suit his argument.
Yeah,
but you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
It does feature in here, and I thought this was, an honest and fair account of what a disgrace Hilary Benn's fucking speech was.
Yeah, and
although again, it's the portrayal of Corbyn as a bit hapless. He focuses in on the image of Corbyn although I don't know, I thought that was kind of cool, just how Corbyn can disguise his hatred for.
Yeah, I know. I thought it was good. He also does describe I think it was an MP who didn't go on the record who said that some of the MPs who voted for bombing Syria did so specifically with Corbyn's leadership in mind, which I was told when I suggested it was a horrible accusation. These people care about lives. I'm like, well, if they cared, they wouldn't bomb them. But
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty simple understanding of what caring looks like. If caring looks like a drone strike, then I don't want to care. If I'm going to be honest.
Yeah.
Like,
No, that's right. Owen does point out how sick it is that like MPs were just using these life or death matters as a way to get at Corbyn and just score a point against the man they hate. And to his credit, I thought that was one of the better passages of the book.
yeah, and also one of the MPs who goes on the record quite a bit is Jonathan Ashworth, who comes across almost like pretty neutral in what he says. He seems like
I didn't like Jonathan Ashworth's both sides he takes in this. So it's like I want someone on the left. Give me fucking Lavery or something.
Oh yeah, he didn't have him as a source. He just talks about
Did he
filling.
not?
No, I don't think he was a source, or at least he wasn't named as a source. Wait, no, he was actually, because he mentioned that Ian Lavery thought that that Corbyn should have sacked him over the EU stuff.
Yeah. No, that's interesting because that's one of the key problems of this book. I mean, it's not a problem if this stuff is on the historical record, really, but that shit is all in left out as well. This book actually, for all its attempt to set out an alternative stall to Pogrund and Maguire's account of the last few years, it rehashes so much information almost verbatim from that book. I'm not saying literally verbatim. Owen's not guilty of plagiarism, but sometimes it's like the same anecdotes, clearly from the same sources, just explained like almost in the same way. And I don't know. So do you remember a few on that very? Owen points out rightly it was a strategic misstep when Corbyn did that Vice documentary in 2016.
Yeah.
But do you remember where Corbyn says that thing about like the British media has an incredibly shallow, trivial, facile kind of perspective on everything? I thought it was a wonderful quote. I think it was when he was like slagging off Jonathan Friedland for writing some shite.
Yeah, I remember this. That bit got him in trouble. He was like, he's not a nice guy, and
he's a bad guy, Seamus. He is. I think Jonathan Friedland's a terrible guy, and he's one of the Guardian shitheads that Owen didn't give any flack in this book.
Wasn't he the one who named someone who had the same name as someone else who was a parliamentary candidate? Was it him, Jonathan Friedland?
Yeah.
Like, he wouldn't have done that to
Muslims numerous times.
Yeah. So, I think Corbyn's assessment of him is essentially accurate.
Yeah, but unfortunately, like, I felt that Corbyn's sentiment towards the British media reading this, because like I've already got the gossip book about the Corbyn, about all, who hated who in the leader's office and blah, 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 and all that, like, interpersonal stuff, which is, if you're trying to tell the story of a movement, that is but one part of the whole picture. Admittedly, it's a big part, but that it really should take much of a wider view. And unfortunately, I just found some of the stuff in this book to be like really shallow and trivial, the way that it repeatedly zones in on these things like Corbyn not singing the national anthem. The way I remember that at the time was everyone on the left thought that was
fine,
a confected outrage, a load of bollocks. And were I writing an alternate account of the last 5 years from a left-wing perspective, the stuff I would focus on wouldn't be like the melt talking points, the not singing the national anthem, the saying he only is 7 out of 10 on the EU. Like, who fucking cares? This stuff is just trivial horse race shit,
I think one of the interesting points that I found was like there was a point where Jeremy Corbyn just, how he'd get annoyed with journalists who were outside his house or who were following him around, and there's an anecdote about early in the leadership where he didn't get a car to pick him up straight from outside from the place where you normally get picked up, and he walked to get a cab, and he's on the phone with his son, and the thing the observation Owen makes, which I find a bit hard to believe, was that Corbyn's attitude to the press damaged his standing with the public. The public fucking hate the press. I'm sorry. Like, I know if you're a journalist, that's hard to take. The public loathe the press, like from every angle. I mean, I can't think of a profession that is more disliked in this country, other than maybe real estate, estate agents and maybe some lawyers.
Exactly, landlords probably. Yeah, what I remember.
Yeah. It's not a
profession.
What
I remember, not a No, that's true. It's a form of parasite. But what I remember about that time, remember the 2017 election when Corbyn really kind of came alive after a few, admittedly, seemingly quite moribund sort of months of leadership in a lot of ways, like. Then, where I should say I 100% supported him the whole time, but that's just me. But he really came out fighting against journalists. Like when they were like asking him like again shallow or trivial shit, he would just be like, I'm not going to answer that bloody question. Like there was this thing, like British journalism. There was this thing where they just like for years after Corbyn was elected, the first and second times, up until the 2017 election, he would constantly have to field questions about his leadership. That was always, he should have been able to talk about what his leadership was. Instead, they would just always ask him questions about, is your leadership tenable? Do you think you should resign? Blah 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 blah. And it had an effect of like making that the story. And I think that was in the British media. I don't think that the Corbynite media strategy could have prevented the British media from taking that approach.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Anyway, we were talking about 2017. That's kind of a nice way to go into chapter 4 because it's he's titled it Dysfunction, so it's about the bit in the run-up to 2017.
Oh, Christ, yeah,
and
okay.
This chapter, to me, I'm going to give my just a summary of the chapter. It feels like a call to a type of left managerialism that I just think doesn't work and wouldn't
left,
work.
But a different kind of left. If you don't see how Keir Starmer is advancing the social democratic struggle or whatever
it's not that melted, to be fair, but it does take it does take a suspiciously similar there's a suspiciously similar tone and taste to it, I think, as you go through. And he gets really deep into like the office dysfunction. In fact, this is where the anecdote I was talking about actually pops up, about him getting into the cab while he's followed by the press, and he's just And the quote is, "Such a performance could only leave the average punter with a deeply negative image of the new Labour leader." And I'm like, no, I wrote X to doubt, which is like, no, of course, I don't think him being contemptuous of the press, who are widely disliked, could have damaged his perception among the public.
No, I don't think so.
I think if he told them to piss off, I know that the press would have lost their minds, but it probably would have improved his ratings. And there is a somewhat that he does make the point about Corbyn's personal ratings quite a bit throughout. And the Office seemed to have no strategy to try and reverse it, and they just didn't. But
what's his strategy? Again, that's the thing. If this is a strategy book rather than a history book, let's hear it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it is just like hindsight shit. Like, I mean, no. The thing is, I guess he was saying this at the time, so maybe that's unfair. But I feel like we're talking about the dysfunction. Now, this chapter, I mean, I would be more focused on the wrecking prior to 2017. It maybe you could argue the years 2017 to 19 did show a kind of dysfunction that resulted in the end of the project, but I think that the project was just so under siege at this point, and it had just got off to such a shaky start, and it was so unprecedented that I don't know what what good it does pointing out that this clearly, isolated and unprepared operation wasn't the most smoothly running in the world. I mean, you can point that out, but I wouldn't make that the focus. I just think things would have been, so impossible in those early months of Corbyn, especially almost the first 2 years, whatever happened.
I think there's a point. He talks to Rory McQueen, who at the time was an economics PhD student, and he gets
Mm.
hired into the office. And
Yeah,
try and
I
see.
rate Rory.
Yeah, I think they follow me on Twitter. So again, this is a case where I have to be nice about someone because they follow me on Twitter. No,
Yeah, same.
but he makes the point. The quote is, "We didn't make any announcements, didn't advance left wing policy in any way because we were literally trying to be there until tomorrow." Like
Yeah, that's
that.
it. That's it.
That's it. That summarizes it.
They could not do more than just defend the project at that point. It was, and that was what Len McCluskey pointed out in his review of Owen's book. It was just such a struggle from day to fucking day. Incidentally, that's what Matt Zarb-Cousin has told me about his time working for Jeremy as well. They can never kind of get anything new launched and off the ground because they were just forced into that defensive position where they just constantly had, Matt was just on the phone 24/7 basically just rebutting stupid stories briefed by their own MPs.
Matt does get a mention.
Untenable.
He does get a few mentions in the book, and they're all positive.
Yeah, he's quoted in the book. And Owen is very positive about Matt, and Matt gives I think several quotes.
An interesting question: did the Wreckers coordinate with Theresa May on calling that election? I don't think so. There's nothing in the book that suggests that they did that. And
I don't. I've no idea about that. The thing is, this doesn't get into the outside forces. If Seamus didn't do it, then it's not fucking interesting. Slightly unfair.
That is unfair.
Sorry, Seamus or Kerry.
There is a point. Yeah, that's another one of the main characters, if you like, of this book that did get introduced in the third chapter because she was brought in to manage the office and
a legend.
And successfully managed the office because the improvement in the operation is mentioned by Owen. But yeah. And there is a point which was that it's kind of repeated, which is that Corbyn was stubborn and didn't want to play the game, which I don't know. It felt like he was pretty happy to. Yeah, first of all, fuck the game. You shouldn't play the game. But I don't know. I feel like that was a part of his character that led to his early success.
It was. All the things that people cite as Corbyn's flaws were reasons that he became leader in the first place and reasons for his success relative to whatever. So, I mean, like, that, I think even Owen acknowledges that. That's unfortunately the Corbyn conundrum. Like, Corbyn being just an absolutely lovely man meant that sometimes he didn't want to get into scraps that where he would have had to take people on head on. Fortunately, Corbyn being an absolutely lovely person also meant that he had this kind of real like magnetic emotional appeal to a lot of people, and initially everyone in the PLP liked him. So they nominated him. This
is also the chapter where I think Mr. Seamus Milne is properly introduced.
Seamus Milne.
He is properly introduced, and so he describes the reason he became the director of strategy and communications was because of an obligation to get involved. And this comes back to a point that you and I talked about in DMs and we talked about earlier, which is that the left do not have a deep bench at this point. Still don't have a very deep bench. And so Seamus Milne probably goes into that position as the one person who is probably willing to do it, who Corbyn relatively trusted to hold that position.
Yeah, I think it's been reported that they asked Kevin Maguire from the Mirror, but he said no, and his politics are very different to Corbyn's. Maguire was like the closest journalist to Gordon Brown.
Yeah, and I think this does go into the 2017 election a little bit because it mentions that it's just an example of Milne's good judgment here. Yeah, I wrote sign of good judgment and competence when Milne was one of the loudest voices calling for Labour to link the heightened risk of terrorism with British foreign policy, which everyone intuitively understands in this country. I've never met anyone who didn't intuitively understand that.
Yeah, well, I think that we can return to that in the later sections of the book when we get to further questions about foreign policy, because I think that is a key example of what I think flies in the face of Owen's thesis in the rest of this book, which is that Corbyn's foreign policy became kind of a distraction and should have just been de-emphasized, and the forces of imperialism should have basically been compromised with, which I think is you can say that's uncharitable, but I think that's what John McDonnell did, which is the strategy that Owen openly praises.
Yeah.
So I personally don't think that's an unfair description of what he would have liked to have happened. And so well, obviously we see a good example of what having somebody like Seamus Milne, who was in tune with Corbyn's view of the world, could do in terms of clearly articulating an argument that flew in the face of the conventional logic of British electoral politics, but nonetheless had wide popular appeal and was fucking true.
Yeah, and so a lot of this chapter is a critique of Seamus Milne's managerial abilities and the ability of the office to function. He makes the fair point, which is that Seamus Milne is not used to doing this job. I think that's an entirely fair point. I don't think that's a slight on Seamus Milne. I don't think Owen's wrong for pointing it out. It was just the fact that that was the case at the time.
Yeah.
And then we go into... It talks about when they would get new hires and they wouldn't sort out the IT, and it was just, in general, quite a bit of a mess. And...
that stuff, I mean, is... overemphasized in terms of the forces against the project. I think probably the poor IT was a factor, but maybe maybe not quite up there.
And it talks about John McDonnell bringing on Bob Kerslake, the former head of the Civil Service, who tried to professionalize the office and got Seamus Milne to hire people who could, and they headhunted people from other teams that could help. Which, I mean, is not a bad thing to do. I don't think necessarily.
No.
I think that's a point in McDonnell's favour a little bit. I think because... and then there's this bizarre analogy where Milne is compared to Mesut Ozil, the Arsenal footballer. Which, I mean, okay, I suppose... so gifted a level of intricacy and flair and playmaking ability that's just unparalleled, but he wouldn't do the dirty work. If you have a team with him, you need them to do the stuff he won't, like tracking back, which I'm not going to say falls into forced football metaphors, but it is an interesting comparison, given how much of a troll Mesut Ozil is and how much he winds up people who deserve to get wound up.
This is all lost opinion. On me, man.
Yeah, it's a rare football opinion from me, everyone. I'm sorry to the chat. You guys don't know I like football sometimes. I used to play sports. I used to be fit.
You don't go to these long-haired politicos to get football banter.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a comment about Jeremy Corbyn not being the most strategic person, but that's because he never had to be, I don't think. I think that's more of a factor of him not ever getting advancement. And this goes back to the point I made earlier, which is that if the left is systematically shut out of these positions, how do we actually think this is going to work, right? How are we going to get the experience and the skills to actually do these things in the proper way? We can't, so we have to find other ways to do it, I think, is probably where my conclusion would have gone from these points. But yeah, and then he talks about Salisbury, the Salisbury attack, and how that seemed to damage Corbyn's personal ratings. The only thing is that it didn't seem to fatally wound the party's polling. There's very little polling evidence to suggest that people remembered it beyond a couple of months after.
No, it didn't. Well, I mean, I blame in part people like John McDonnell for not getting behind Jeremy on that one, because Owen talks about how the Brexit issue was all-encompassing, wreaked havoc in a number of ways on the party, but one thing that it did was it diminished Jeremy's straight-talking, honest reputation. Well, I think if you want to diminish Jeremy Corbyn's straight-talking, honest reputation, get him up there and have him, waving around his dick at Russia and trying to sound like the tough man who's gonna fucking go to war with you. That would have been just totally against everything that Corbyn is about, to have him take this aggressive line. On Russia, it's not that he and Milne are actual supporters of the Putin regime, as Owen explains in this book. Although there is a quite dishonest summation on, I think, page 100 of Milne's anti-imperialism that includes a little section that says imperialism can often cross over into support for dictators, whatever. He doesn't specify.
Right.
Yeah, anti-imperialism. Sorry. Yeah, he
Yeah.
doesn't specify what
Imperialism
he
also
means
does
like
that, to be
this.
fair. Um,
Yes, no, imperialism definitely does. But he doesn't specify what he means by that because elsewhere he clarifies that Seamus Milne and Jeremy Corbyn don't love Putin. But yeah, I think it would have been totally dishonest to have Jeremy Corbyn kind of trying to be like the tough guy, the imperialist. You can't do that, and so and the de-emphasization. Of Corbyn's anti-imperialist beliefs, I think was kind of one of the things that was fatal to the project because it resulted in confusion. About what he actually believed in. It was never clearly articulated because, people like John McDonnell and Owen freaked out when Jeremy Corbyn tried to explain, tried to actually put that forward. It's a tragedy of the Corbyn project that after that definitive speech that you talked about, where Corbyn linked terror to austerity and to British intervention abroad, that kind of line wasn't pursued further, that Labour didn't seize on that and try to push the Overton window further. And I see the Salisbury thing as one of the few moments where there actually was an attempt to shift the dial and say, well, in the past, the security services, have given us information that is not trustworthy. They are not infallible. And the amount of stick that Seamus Milne got for saying that, I thought was outrageous. And I am certain that Owen Jones is somebody who has a skeptical attitude towards the security services. I think it's just insulting to people's intelligence that he doesn't think that idea can be communicated to a mass audience. The problem is not Jeremy Corbyn's and Seamus Milne's anti-imperialist beliefs. The problem was that because they were so isolated in them, they were rarely able to clearly articulate them.
Yeah. I'm just kind of skipping ahead through the chapter. One of the highlights for the rest of this is Rosie Winterton being sacked by Carrie Murphy.
Carrie Murphy.
The line is killer. Sorry, Rosie, it's over. Oh, just like absolutely brutal. I can't do the accent. I can't do the accent, unfortunately.
It's always like said Kerry Murphy Scottishly.
Yeah. Like, there is a bit of. He doesn't do that very often. He does it every once in a while. He does lean into it, but yeah, that was. And apparently she was incredibly stunned by the fact it was over. I mean, if you openly oppose the leader from the position of chief whip, I don't know that you should have been stunned, but that's kind of the obvious point. I don't think.
Did you think that chapter sounded almost sympathetic to Rosie Winterton? Because she cried, really? She had been when a leader of a party appoints you the chief whip, you're supposed to be the chief whip for them, not for their internal opponents.
Yeah.
Which was how Winterton did the job. Corbyn replaced her with Nick Brown, who was not from the left of the party, but actually was the whip for the leader, which is what that job is supposed to be. Winterton was one of the worst wreckers of the early Corbyn era. And people give Kerry Murphy a lot of shit, but for me, that's an example of her at her best. The way, the killer instinct she had that, by all accounts, Corbyn and Milne lacked.
Yeah, there is a point about Corbyn being unable to confront these difficult conversations because he's just too. And this is the point that I make, which is that he's just too. He's maybe a bit too soft for this style of politics that need it.
Yeah.
I think.
I mean, the problem is, though, that the alternative to that is posited by people like Owen as the John McDonnell formula, which is literally just, Parliamentary Labour Party, do you want some concessions? How many concessions can I give you? Oh, here, have a concession that you didn't even fucking ask for. It is literally the opposite to being hard and standing up for what you believe in and shit. It is the opposite to taking a firm line for McDonnell's strategy.
Yeah, and so we get to, in Chapter 5, the actual campaign, the 2017 election. I thought it Because it's a nice bit. It's a nice bit. It's a nice memory of the 2017 election. I remember that night very poorly, actually, because I got very drunk. Um, just full disclosure, that night was I had a terrible hangover the next day after that election. But I thought it was mostly all right. It didn't seem like it was too egregious on too many points, and he makes some good observations about how Jeremy Corbyn turned his personal ratings around because he was relaxed. He contrasted well with Theresa May. The leader's office actually did work quite well by all accounts during this time. Obviously, the party HQ did not work well.
I'm just going to say that Seamus Milne and Kerry Murphy were both more senior in Corbyn's office at the 2017 election than the 2019 election. Make of that what you will.
Yes, there's a point. Actually, I do make that is an interesting point because he does specifically talk about Kerry Murphy's move to Labour HQ, I think, is what happened.
Terrible
and
mistake.
And Seamus Milne was made into a political advisor rather than the strategic communications, whatever is full time. That I do note because it is my dad's birthday, that there is an anecdote at one in a Reading car park passing office workers stopped to listen. Now my dad's not an office worker, but he did stop by and actually catch that speech by Jeremy Corbyn, which flipped him from non-voting Marxist-Leninist to Labour for the first time since 1997.
Oh, great.
So there you go. My dad was that desperate to get rid of the Tories that he voted in 97. But yeah, there you go. Kind of
Corbyn
cool
and Blair, the lads.
Yeah. It's such a strange combo, but where my parents live, the Lib Dems are usually the second party. So
Corbyn and Blair are the two most successful Labour leaders of the last couple of decades, so it does actually make sense.
Yeah, it does make a degree of sense. But yeah, there you go. That's a fun one for you all because it's not often my hometown gets called out in political books. So I thought I'd mention that one, and that was. I recognised people in that crowd, and it was very strange to see people who I knew were not left-wing listening to Jeremy Corbyn. A very strange time. Yeah. And that's kind of the way he sort of captures the 2017 spirit, which is that he's speaking to big crowds, and people who weren't normally into politics would stop and listen, and that obviously shifts the election. He does make the point about how the vote share changed based on where Corbyn visited and where he didn't visit, and where Theresa May visited and where she didn't, which was that in seats where Corbyn visited, the Labour vote went up an average of 18.9%, which is
he was
ridiculous.
A genuine asset.
Ridiculous.
Genuine asset to the party.
Yeah, and it went up in general by 9.8, which I mean, so you could say that he was a ridiculous asset, and Theresa May was not. Although she also raised her party's vote share compared to the national performance, so I'm not saying that she was completely terrible. When you also shouldn't, because that's a counterfactual way of looking at her leadership. She got the most votes up until then of a Tory leader since 1987. So seems this is one of those narratives that winds me up, which is Theresa May was terrible. Well, if she was so terrible, why'd she get 43%? It doesn't sound terrible to me. Anyway. They always say it's the Leave voters, but I don't quite buy that was the case, at least at that election. And he talks about the social media operation, which was much better in 2017. Well, relatively speaking, in 2017 and 2019. But otherwise, it's just a largely decent account of the 2017 election and the immediate aftermath, where he references Grenfell and and the Tories did seem like they were in a legitimate crisis. They looked like they were going to melt down completely, and in fact, that it's easy to forget now. They did look like they had a 2-year meltdown in the run up to the 2019 election.
Yeah, and you have to think, that this is one reason why I think there should be, even more focus on just the sheer amount of delegitimization of Corbyn by his own MPs and and from people like The Guardian and stuff, when he proved to be the kind of electoral asset that you that you have identified, I think it just becomes really criminal what they did, because they basically made it that they knocked. There was an actual thing. There was a Corbyn mania, and they were still no, we'll just fuck this. We'll get our nice leader who won't have their own mania named after them. but we'll have something we like more, whatever the party's fortunes. And they basically, Corbyn could have been like Blair levels of electorally successful if there hadn't been this constant like delegitimization. And that's why I still think that the coup in 2016 probably made him unelectable.
Yeah.
I honestly think that just that concerted effort of we're going to portray our own leader as beyond the pale for just this 3-month period, I think it was.
Yeah.
Plus change. When it came to 2017, that turned it from, a landslide victory to just taking away the government's majority and winning a huge share of the vote.
And an acquaintance of mine, Break Him as a Man is mentioned in this, because it's a particularly horrible episode. It is covered in Alex Nunn's book as well. But I was just going to say that you mentioned like the delegitimization of the leader. An acquaintance of mine who might or might not be a Tory, I'm not sure anymore, but was at the time in 2019, said, I can't wait for these Labour MPs who've been saying their leader is terrible and all of this to come round and try and win our votes now. And I'm like, like, of course, it's absolutely ridiculous on its face. Why would I vote for someone who keeps telling me that the guy who's there in charge of their party is terrible and beyond the pale and democratically unacceptable? How could I bring myself to do it? And obviously, the Conservatives took full advantage of that, and I think that was reflected partly in who lost their seat and who didn't, to an extent. And where we lost as well, because, we lost John Mann, the terrible, terrible MP, former MP. He's now Lord John Mann. Which, the less said about that, the better. His seat was the strongest swing against Labour in the country, in the poorest performing county in the country, which is my home, which is the county where I currently live. It's terrible. I hate it here. So I do not like it. I live in the Labour seat, but so it's not the end of the world. But the next chapter is pretty much exclusively about the bind Labour are in on Brexit. And he names it after Bandersnatch, which was not a terrible experiment by Black Mirror, but I just kind of didn't get it. And
I don't know. I just found the reference kind of annoying for some reason. I couldn't quite identify why, but I was like, just Black Mirror. Like, come on. It's like there's a Stranger Things reference as well. I'm like, has Owen got a product placement deal with Netflix or something?
I think he just enjoys Black Mirror and Stranger Things. Nothing wrong with it. I enjoy a lot of
Fair enough.
Mirror. I know it's lib stuff, but I do enjoy a bit of Black Mirror. I'm just going to be fair.
I admit, I've got a product placement with Bob Dylan. That's why we keep talking about him.
I can't believe it. I won't talk about why I keep referencing Black Metal
on the stream. He's the Bud Light of music. What have you got one with like Burzum or like?
No.
Megadeth.
A band I keep slating on the stream live, so they're not doing a good job. There was one quote here that I kind of enjoyed, but it was Alan Johnson being terrible to Clive Lewis. Fuck off and tell your fucking Momentum trot mates who are plastering my surgery with shit to fuck off as well. You've ruined this party. Kind of rich from Alan Johnson, but hey, him being a snake is not news to us.
That was a good bit of gossip, just like in terms of the sheer vileness of some of Corbyn's right-wing opponents. That bit about Alan Johnson, plus the very vivid description of some of the PLP meetings where people would just get up one by one to fucking verbally abuse Corbyn.
I found it really hard to read in parts, actually, some of it. And I read it, and especially, we'll get to it at the end, but like the final PLP meeting, the PLP meeting after the election just sounded fucking horrible to me. Because it basically sounded like every MP, one after another, came up and just started shouting at him. Like they'd earned the right to do that for some reason to another person. I don't know. I say a lot about how bad the culture must be in the Labour Party and why certain people end up being MPs. I mean, I couldn't be in that environment. I don't think no other workplace would tolerate that kind of behaviour. And I think it's strange that the Labour Party, which is supposed to represent workers, tolerates it. And if they wanted to crack down on this toxic culture that exists in the party, they'd do it from the top, and they'd start getting rid of these MPs. If I'm honest. I would, if in any of the jobs I've had in the past, if I had started shouting at my boss as part of a, I would have been sacked probably. It would have been gross misconduct.
Yeah,
You know?
well, in I think maybe the next chapter, whatever the
It's
anti-Semitism
the
one
next one,
is.
yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna get to some MPs verbally abusing people, but
Yeah, but
like
this bit also talks about the people's vote and how it seemed to be a cult of personality around Chuka Ramuda, Anna Subri, and Chris Leslie.
yeah, no, a bit. I agree with Owen on, but I think is unfortunately a bit kind of hindsighty in the classic Keir Starmer way. Is that basically after the 2017 election, Corbyn should have completely ruled out a second referendum. The thing is, though, that it it basically seemed like it had been ruled out in 2017. It was like, no, look, there's clearly not the parliamentary arithmetic for a second referendum. This shit is fucking doomed. Why are you campaigning for this shit when we want another election to remove this parliamentary deadlock? And it just became, for the people who didn't want an election, it just became their way of putting off an election until Labour would lose it.
Yeah.
Like, it literally, for like 2 years, Labour were leading in the polls, and then the People's Vote people were like, I don't think an election is really what this country needs at this difficult time. We need Theresa May or Boris Johnson's Theresa May's ghost government, or then Boris Johnson's subsequent, just him taking over her one. That's the shit we need right now, for some reason.
Yeah, there is a quote here that I just kind of found that has wound me up a bit, which was Gloria De Piero, expressing anger that a workers' party had ended up with an overwhelmingly middle-class membership. I don't think a lot of the membership of that middle class, given the age profile for most of the active ones. And also, was Labour ever really a workers' party? I'm just asking questions.
Well, her politics aren't pro-fucking worker. She's like a Blairite who's really pro-Brexit, who now works, for Times Radio, regurgitating right-wing talking points. So, I mean, I have to say, like the John Ashworth bits, she wasn't the quotes from her weren't my favourite bits in the book.
There's a point a bit before that where he talks about another Europe as possible, and that it provided left cover for a Remain insurgency, which could only inflict political damage on the Corbyn project, which, yes, it did. And
I agree.
And it did, and it was obvious that it would. And I once I started posting relentlessly because I got terminal online brain, it was obvious to me, like, I don't know how you don't notice that.
I was completely against it, and...
Oh, have we... Oh, we lost Jack. That's less than ideal. Hold on, everyone. Let's see if he shows up. Oh, Jack's back. Hey.
Oh, sorry about that.
Did you accidentally hang up?
No, it must have. I think it was just Discord did the thing again.
Oh, okay. Didn't do it to me.
Yeah, sorry. But yeah, no. I think Michael Chesham's MI5 handlers hacked the system.
Yeah.
But no, I was just saying Michael Chesham's quoted in the book as saying we, as in the quote unquote left Remain people, detoxified the Remain movement, and that sounds laughable to you or I because.
Oh, okay. It might be my turn. It's my turn. All right, everyone. Sorry, Jack. It was my turn for the crash.
So I was just saying, Michael Chesham, obviously him saying he detoxified anything is a laugh to us because he's such a risible figure. But what he's saying really is what you say, that he gave left cover to this very reactionary Remain movement, which was all just about defending the interests of a particular wing of capital and of a former, of a political establishment that had been thrown out into the cold by respectively a leftward Labour drift and a rightward Conservative drift. And the left should never ever have got involved in that at all. I don't think it's terrible, and I think it was a strategic mistake to completely cede Brexit to the right and not have a sizable contingent of people on the left saying we accept the result of a referendum. which was such an effective line for Labour in 2017. And there was an extraordinary amount of money, an extraordinary amount of media weight thrown behind this AstroTurf campaign for a second referendum that was never likely to happen. That I ultimately think, whatever some low level people's intentions were, I think it was in a big part about destroying the Corbyn leadership. No matter what Alistair Campbell protests, I don't think he's a Labour loyalist to the point where he'd want Corbyn to form a government at all. I think that he was absolutely trying to build a new base outside of the left, which then somebody like Keir Starmer could, pick up the torch and carry towards the finishing line of Labour leadership.
In fact, Keir Starmer is brought up in this bit because he does the Remain will be on the ballot bit.
Absolutely destructive thing to do, terrible. And Owen is right to say that a second referendum should absolutely have been ruled out in 2017. The problem was it did at the time just feel like a crank hobby horse. It didn't feel like a realistic prospect at all. At that point, it did really seem like Labour should maintain an element of ambiguity because we didn't know where the Tory position was going to go. So in retrospect, I definitely think Corbyn should have said, this is never going to happen. We will never support this. I mean, obviously, then it would have been even worse if the shit had happened anyway and he would have been forced to back it after that, after saying that. So that being that definitive always comes with a cost. But the fact is, it did just seem when, after the 2017 election, the old Blairite ghouls, who, no longer were prominent in Labour politics, but were still in the media all the time. They were all saying throughout the election, the 2017 election, that Labour should not pursue its successful strategy of bringing the country together. It should focus monomaniacally on taking a hyper-partisan stance on Brexit. That was clearly just wrecking. That was clearly just people who could have Labour put next to their name on a television caption, trying to muddy Labour's message so as to damage the leadership. But after the 2017 election, when these people instantly shifted to Remain, we need a second referendum, we don't need another election to get that one last push so Jeremy Corbyn is Prime Minister and we can have a radical Labour government. It was so fucking transparent, It was just unbelievably obvious what they were doing. Unfortunately, we didn't anticipate the extent to which that this movement would ultimately be successful in cleaving a massive division in Labour's base.
Yeah, and a lot of the chat are pointing out, remembering when anyone who advocated a soft Brexit was treated as if they were a UKIP light type person. I remember when I was called UKIP light, and I took quite a bit of exception to that for a lot of different reasons, especially because I voted Remain. And campaigned for Remain. I regret that now, I think, for sure, because every percentage point closer those people got made this more successful, and I hate it. I hate it, basically. But this is also the bit where we get the Change UK characters showing up, and there seem to be two schools of thought that exist in Corbyn's inner circle, one of which is these people are complete clowns, and majority public opinion is with the Corbynite position. So therefore, we don't have to worry about these minor characters. It's not the SDP, because the SDP had significant characters with them. And the other school of thought, which is the McDonald's
James
school
Schneider
of thought,
was saying that at the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
The McDonald's school of thought, which is, holy shit, it's the SDP again. And we got fucked big time by the SDP. Now, it turns out we got fucked big time by Change UK, but in a different way.
I'm sorry. It's just that is just an example of John McDonnell losing his touch, and it's one of the things that his attempt to keep the Parliamentary Labour Party on side was one of the things that destroyed the Corbyn project, in my opinion. And ultimately, as Owen said in that Prospect interview I listened to, at the end of the Corbyn era, a lot of Labour MPs who had previously despised John McDonnell had come to quite respect him. Now, I would say if you go up in the estimations of the Parliamentary Labour Party, then you are doing something wrong.
Yeah,
I really think, John McDonnell, when they all fucking hated him, was so much cooler. John McDonnell, when he sat down, when he took on Alistair Campbell on Question Time, and the hate that the two men felt for each other was just there on display. McDonnell seeming genuinely morally repulsed by Alistair Campbell's role in Iraq and his role in turning politics into even more of a dishonest shit show than it was before, and the way that New Labour had left communities behind, etc. That's so much of a cooler guy than the McDonnell who 2 or 3 years later was sat down with Alistair Campbell having a pally interview where he disgracefully said that Tony Blair is not a war criminal.
Oh.
I don't know if that's the Keir Starmer hyper-legalistic position that the Iraq war was a war crime, but Tony Blair is not a war criminal.
Might well
be. But I think that John McDonnell, having been asked that same question, in fact, I'm certain he would have said, yes, I think Tony Blair is a war criminal. He would have probably said he thinks Alistair Campbell is one.
Yeah.
So I just think, I think that's, absolutely disgraceful. But where McDonnell's strategy of conciliation with Labour's incredibly right-wing PLP actually contributed in great part to the destruction of the project was that by being so opposed to a split, he basically diminished the left's parliamentary standing, because, frankly, if McDonnell was a key advocate of not pursuing mandatory selection against MPs, he really backtracked on party democracy, and there are concrete examples like when he intervened in a democratic process to prevent Diana Johnson, a right-wing MP's CLP, deselecting her. Now, Johnson is one of the most virulent imperialists on the Labour front bench. Or maybe she's just on the back bench and she just loves the disgusting imperialist shit so much she does it, just for fun. But McDonnell intervened against the members in her CLP to protect her. And this is what I'm saying. The Owen Jones analysis that posits McDonnell as the hero is not a members first analysis at all, I don't think. Because if we were not going to pursue mandatory reselection and really a top-down democratization of the party, an uphaul, a kind of forced overhaul of the parliamentary party, we really needed some of the cunts to fuck off on their own accord.
Yeah, self-deselection was was something that would have helped. I think it also would have solidified the left position after the election, whatever the result.
Yeah, it would. That's the key thing. There was, it was still because fucking stupid MPs kept giving their nominations to fucking Emily Thornberry and Clive Lewis. Rebecca Long Bailey, it almost, I'm sure she would have always got on the ballot, but it was pretty close for a while. It took her fucking ages to get the requisite 25 signatures, which made the left look so weak. We really could have frankly done with better but fewer, I think. Then this, the fact that that certain elements of the left, like McDonnell, made such a conscious effort to keep these terribly right-wing MPs on side, meant that whoever the anointed right-wing successor to Corbyn was had an incredible base of support at their disposal that Corbyn never had.
Yeah, this is also the one that has the Ian Lavery anecdotes where he if you ever fucking call me racist, you'll know about it. He said it to Keir Starmer, which Yeah.
Again, this is what I'm saying, man. The same anecdote, almost word for word, is in Left Out.
Yeah.
Like, is it literally just like some senior source sends out an all-purpose email, like CC's both Owen and Gabriel Pogren and Patrick
But this
Maguire.
is a general point about when they were trying to figure out what the fuck the Brexit position should be. There were these quite strong conflicts, and there are always these sorts of comments where they're like, Jeremy knew we were right, we can't do a Remain position, but he also wouldn't confront the membership about it, and because he was always unfailingly a Democrat first, it seemed, except when they made him take the Remain position, which made him look like not a Democrat.
Yeah, that is the issue. Is that it may have. I think there are certain things that the leader needs to like lead the party on, and I think Owen does make this point in the book that Corbyn didn't really do that on Brexit, in that somebody did kind of need to say, look, we have to, we can't go full Remain, because it wasn't a possibility before the party was kind of forced into that position. I guess he genuinely felt it had to be done. I don't think that Owen had to write a column advocating that position. Like, this is the thing that made me really hate the Remain movement so much more, was that so they spent 2 years wrecking the Labour leadership because it didn't have their position on Brexit. And then when Labour freaked out at the European election results in 2019 and adopted
in this book,
a second referendum position, I thought that was wrong. I thought they should have held tight. But then I didn't advocate that position, but I didn't then just start like wrecking the leadership because of that thing, which is why, I actually despise Michael Chesham and Paul Mason and all the people who they thought that what being one way or another on Brexit was more important than a transformative socialist project, because I think it was because of the propaganda war that it became that Brexit was what prevented that project, was what was preventing that project from happening. It didn't just naturally happen that a large amount of people saw this preposterous pie in the sky fucking second referendum idea as preferable to a government that was radically uproot society, and it's just
yeah,
and it's so frustrating.
The next chapter is going to be almost as frustrating and as much of a conversation, because it's the chapter that covers the anti-Semitism crisis, and there are lots of points here that we see made everywhere, which is that the leadership should have been more decisive and clear on anti-Semitism. I think that is a position that we all more or less accept at this point.
Well, who couldn't?
Exactly.
That's the thing. Who couldn't? It's self-evidently Labour had a reputation for anti-Semitism at that point that has mysteriously disappeared under its new leadership and lost the trust of the Jewish community to a great extent. Like, that's objectively true. So I feel like almost saying they could have, how did you phrase it?
Wait,
because
when in DMs?
No, just now. That they could have done
decisive.
Things different.
Yeah, they should have
been more decisive.
Yeah,
decisive and clear. Absolutely. Of course they should have. But what does that mean? What does that look like?
Yeah, and that's kind of something this is kind of the trap between being a strategy book and a history book, which seems like Owen kind of got stuck between, and he also does make a couple of good observations here, which was that the UK has never had a real reckoning with its own anti-Semitic history, which I think is true. Mm-hmm. Everyone would accept that. And that there was no scandal when Theresa May unveiled the Nancy Astor statue, which should have been a scandal, I think, at this point. And he goes into a long bit about the deep history of anti-Semitism in the UK and why it produced the reaction it did within the Jewish community, which is, if there's one bit of the book you should read, probably that. There's also the bit that he talks about Israel specifically and the left's relationship to Israel and how that flipped. So obviously earlier on in Israel's history, there was the left generally had a pro-Israel view, I think we would put it, and the Soviet Union actively supported it. Now, the Soviet Union had its own horribly anti-Semitic reasons for supporting the foundation of Israel, I think. I'll leave that to more accomplished historians than myself to discuss. But there were anti-Semitic motivations in the Soviet Union's support for Israel, and he talks about kibbutzim. And this was the passage that was particularly focused on in that Jacobin review, if I recall correctly, because he refers to the foundation of Israel, but he sort of omits bits. If you're describing the foundation of Israel, I find it odd that you omit specific aspects of the foundation of Israel. And he seems to specifically focus on the Six-Day War in 1967, which he identifies as the point where the inversion in the attitude towards Israel and the Palestinians occurred for the left.
Yeah, he said that Israel came to resemble a colonial occupier. Very carefully caveated language.
Yeah.
And then he says that Israel jettisoned its original socialist principles. Frankly, I don't want to get too deep into that part myself, because I'm not a historian of Israel and Palestine either. But I know people who are very knowledgeable about that stuff, who think that Owen really mischaracterized the debate in this. And I think he uses the fact that the left supported Israel in the 1940s and the 60s a bit dishonestly, to be honest, because that really hasn't been the case for a long time. No decent and honest person could have with a concern for human rights could have sat through the 2014 Operation Protective Edge, the horrible massacres of that year, and basically thought that Israel, the nation of Israel, was like a victim in this, and was persecuted on the world stage and was getting a bad rap. I don't think.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah, and he does describe Jeremy Corbyn's own history of pro-Jewish solidarity.
Yeah.
It's quite a long passage, actually. I don't know whether to read the entire thing out, but he does go into quite some detail about his long record on that matter, and then where the first rumblings of this came from, which was the Deir Yassin Remembered Facebook group, if I remember correctly. Or he attended the group's event in the process meeting its founder, Paul Eisen, who went on to produce Holocaust Denial. But obviously at the time, Corbyn didn't know that, and I think the Holocaust Denial came about after that meeting, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I think we needed to be more clear about how people who cite that kind of thing are conspiracy theorists. It is just not realistic to think that Jeremy Corbyn went to that commemoration of a historic massacre because he agreed to the letter with the Holocaust denying beliefs of one of the guys running it. It's just implausible, and it would be inconsistent with his politics. Now, there are a lot of intellectual contortions over the last few years to try and argue how anti-Semitism is consistent with Corbyn's particular politics. I think they're all wrong. And to his credit, Owen Jones does. He maintains that Corbyn doesn't have an anti-Semitic bone in his body, in his phrase.
Yeah. There's also the bit where it's something that's in common with Left Out, and I think in common with a lot of commentary around Jeremy Corbyn's specific personal role in the crisis, such that it was, which is that he found being labelled a racist personally hurtful. And the way they write about this, it makes it read like they think it's unusual that they think that he would be personally hurt by it or
it's very emotionally insensitive, which is precisely what Owen accuses Corbyn of. I mean, Corbyn was not simply accused of, having a little blind spot or anything, of needing to kind of refine his view of the issue, subconscious biases, anything like that. Corbyn was described as an existential threat to Jewish life. Margaret Hodge, somebody who he had known for decades, when she called him fucking racist and anti-Semites in
Yeah.
Parliament. She abused her parliamentary privilege to open up the floodgates to every other cunt to do the same to him. You know, that wasn't even the worst thing she said. She unbelievably cynically said on television that she felt like a Jew in the 1930s packing their bags to flee before the Holocaust, something like that.
Yeah.
This is just in no way helpful. This is totally inflammatory, and as I just said on record, I think cynical stuff. Like totally politically motivated, totally unhelpful, and the fact is that somebody like Stephen Pollard at the Jewish Chronicle, he did not decide that Corbyn was an anti-Semite because whatever the mural or something like that.
Yeah, it was the mural.
He decided that Corbyn was an anti-Semite. At some point, he may have even heard of this obscure backbench MP at some point prior to 2015, when he would have seen Corbyn's support for Palestinian human rights as evidence of anti-Semitism. One thing that Corbyn got in trouble for was it was at a Palestine rights event where Corbyn said something about that some sort of a Jewish pro-Israel activist who was in the audience. Corbyn said that he didn't understand English irony or something like that.
Yeah.
Now, I just have to ask, what kind of a person goes along to a pro-Palestine event, not out of solidarity with the occupied people of Palestine, but to effectively like police the debate? Like, what kind of an individual is more moved by that? Is more moved by the contours of the British Palestine debate than the actual violence and criminality that is happening to the people over there. So I really think that when there's a kind of a debate being led by people who see Corbyn's activism in favor of and obviously the debate isn't totally about Israel and Palestine, but it 100% did factor into it. When the debate is being led by people who see his advocacy of the human rights of a marginalized group as evidence of racism, it is going to go absolutely nowhere. You know, this is never going to be a productive and healthy debate that helps anti-Semitism, that helps Palestinians, or does anything good.
Yeah, so there are a couple of passages actually that kind of link into that in this chapter. So there's a point where Jeremy Corbyn has a meeting with Simon Morris, who is the former chief executive of Jewish Care, and it was, by all accounts, a very good meeting. It was not a horrible atmosphere. There was not a confrontational atmosphere. And one of the strange suggestions that was made, well, not strange because of reasons that Jack's kind of gone into, one of the initial suggestions to attempt to mend Labour and Corbyn's relationship with the British Jewish community was to visit Israel, which that struck me as an odd request, let's say, because we would, not an odd request, but like in the context of what we were told the issue was, strikes me as
not about Israel, is it? I thought it wasn't about Israel.
And in fact, there was a meeting where he had a meeting with the Board of Deputies. It was very well publicized at the time. And one of the deputies, I believe, I'm just checking the passage now, asked Corbyn why he could never say anything positive about Israel, perhaps praising its hospitals for treating Arabs and Jews alike. And
about the hospitals where they treat the people who their shells have just fucking blown up.
And the fact that it seems like these discussions kept coming back to that behind the scenes, never mind in the public forum,
that
where
is
we
quite
obviously, had these
Now,
discussions.
that's the kind of thing that we're supposed to treat as a reasonable good faith demand. Why don't you whitewash the acts of a murderous regime by focusing on this sideshow? And doesn't Owen in that same thing depict this thing where, what is it? It's something about the foundation of Israel, where one of them says one of the Board of Deputies people they're meeting says something like, the left's always had a problem with like the foundation of Israel, and I think Seamus says something like, well, it's more with the ethnic cleansing.
In fact, I have the quote here as Owen wrote it. It's not the state exactly, it's the ethnic cleansing which took place at the end, which he describes as not a productive comment at an event dedicated to confronting contemporary anti-Semitism.
Again, Owen doesn't think that stating the truth is productive. Like, literally, he seems to think that you can just put your anti-imperialism in the fucking attic, like an eccentric relative in a Regency novel. I mean, it's really just. I find that a really risible position, as I do his entire position on the IHRA issue, and I think it legitimizes anti-Palestinian racism, quite frankly, far more than any of the actions of the Labour leadership legitimize anti-Jewish racism, which I think it goes without saying is one of the world's great evils. But it is just one variety of racism, and to deny the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people when a lot of mainstream supporters of Israel openly state, this is Jewish and otherwise, such as the former Labour MP who's not Jewish but is extremely pro-Israel, Joan Ryan, openly stated when she was chair of Labour Friends of Israel, is that were the uprooted Palestinian refugees, who number in the millions, in countries surrounding Israel, were they allowed to return to their homeland, that would be illegitimate because Israel would not be majority Jewish anymore. Now, surely that is racist.
It's a variety of Great Replacement almost in its character.
That's appalling. And so there's not just the ethnic cleansing of the past, but the idea that even today Israel has to be effectively ethnically pure, and that people who have literally lost their homes, they have to take precedent to this, I mean, admittedly not without historical foundation, but kind of strange idea that a nation has to be racially pure.
There is so we mentioned Margaret Hodge, but there was the passage about how Corbyn reacted to that, which was that he was personally quite shaken by it, and
of course he would be.
And of course he would be. I'm not like these people.
I
know. But a senior aide said it was a real sea change in how he was talked about, because, and Owen makes the point that their lawyers concluded that the Labour leader would not sue. He couldn't have because of parliamentary privilege, which is the only place in the UK where you have absolute free speech rights. So, that's great.
What I'm saying. Hodge abused her privilege in, I think, a politically motivated attack.
And Corbyn does demand an apology in exchange for dropping the disciplinary proceedings against her, but he ends up not getting the apology, famously. And McDonnell, he feels like he's betrayed by McDonnell because McDonnell talked to Hodge behind his back. Or so he perceived.
I think you would feel betrayed if your best friend did not have your back in some, your closest ally in politics for many years didn't have your back in something like that. I mean, at the time, I thought the reaction to the Margaret Hodge thing, I remember Phil Burton Cartledge, Phil BC, who writes his great blog, All That Is Solid. He wrote a great reaction piece to the Margaret Hodge thing, where he basically said, look, this is just outrageous. There's a case to be made that Labour has a problem with anti-Semitism, but this goes too far. This just turns it into a personal hate campaign against Jeremy Corbyn, and it seems cynical politically in that she has used her parliamentary privilege to open the floodgates for anyone who has previously tiptoed around the issue in how they've discussed Corbyn, to go all out and use her as the precedent for that. I think that was an absolutely an absolutely pivotal point at which people like Jones and McDonnell lost their nerve.
And there is a big passage about Chris Williamson, and there is an observation that he became a champion for a lot of grassroots members of the party, partially because he actually stood up for the grassroots members. And I'm wondering if there was perhaps, if Owen was should have been making the argument here, or I would have made the argument here, that meant that the left leadership of the party probably should have gone to bat for the membership more, because you would have cut the head off the Williamson snake before it could really,
Yeah. The thing is that this campaign was in part a personal hate campaign against Jeremy Corbyn. It was in part, the manifestation of some genuine concerns that people had. It was in great part, though, a similar demonization campaign to the one against Corbyn of the Labour membership and of the movement behind Corbyn. Now, this is what was unacceptable. I've been told by people close to Corbyn that nothing makes him angrier than hearing the Labour membership denigrated. This is why, you listen to his interview of Grace Blakeley after he stepped down. She asked him, "What have you learned from being Labour leader?" And it's heartbreaking. He says it's a wonderful organisation full of wonderful people, and I'm just like, my God, so much. I'm literally like almost crying.
Yeah,
Corbyn's such a pure fucking man. He really is just a beautiful soul with great principles, and who was just so mistreated. And that's why I think I've reacted so strongly to some of the. Just the way I feel that this book belittles Corbyn. It's constantly, just the adjectives used to describe him. It's always kind of like dithering, doddering, kind of like stumbling, mumbling, that kind of thing. And it's just not. It is. I just feel we need to take a step back and say that this man is a giant of the left. If Ed Miliband can be fucking reclaimed as some, what if he'd have been allowed to do his thing really well? He's more left wing than you think, Can we take a step back and say that Corbyn is the most successful leader with his politics in British political history? Yeah. He should not have been taken for granted when he's leader, and we cannot take for granted what he did now. And it's, frankly, extending an olive branch to John McDonnell. That sounds as if he's aware of who I am and that I have problems with. Obviously McDonnell doesn't know and would not give a fuck about what I say. But him and Corbyn, they both have got a lifetime of brilliant socialist work behind them that makes a brilliant case for either of them as it is. Then the fact that they did get so close to power and they did so much in the short time that they ran the party, I think it makes their position as giants of the left inarguable. So that's why I think when Owen calls this book Operation Salvage, I don't really buy it, because it seems to be about, frankly, salvaging his reputation, salvaging McDonnell's, salvaging Andrew Fisher's, and just kind of pinning the blame on Corbyn and Seamus, who were absolutely just vilified to the most appalling degree, while doing, in many ways, an impressive job in the most difficult circumstances imaginable.
Yeah, Owen does offer what he thinks they should have done from the start, which is a paraphrasing of what I effectively said, but I did get it from the book. It's displayed an uncompromising opposition to anti-Semitism and offered more vocal support for the Palestinian cause. I find that a strange, not a strange combination in the sense that these conflict in any way, but given the body of work before that precedes it, it seems like a strange conclusion to come to that these two things would have diffused the crisis in and of itself.
Yeah, I think it's true that because of the timidity, because of the kind of fractious political nature of it, a timidity around Palestine rights did seep into the Corbyn leadership. But on the other hand, I can think of loads of examples which Owen himself mentions some of them where Corbyn did come out. He did a speech in the Guardian. Like Owen says, we needed like a speech to camera from Corbyn. He totally gave a speech to camera about anti-Semitism, speaking directly into camera about how it's one of the evils of the world. I don't know if the stuff like him going to Israel is was necessarily tenable. I kind of think he would have been murdered in Israel, given it's a highly volatile political situation, and their president had condemned him. So I would suggest that of the people in Israel who've heard of Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, not counting like Palestinians, but probably a lot of them think that he wants to have them all exterminated, unfortunately. Yeah. That's because of a terrible campaign of misinformation, but unfortunately it is what a lot of people believe.
Yeah, there is a final quote at the end here which kind of covers the sort of the summary of what the crisis did to Corbyn and to what Owen believes it did to the Corbyn movement itself. So a senior aide says to Owen Jones, "I fear Jeremy has had a lot of the stuffing knocked out of him." And so I'll read the whole passage. A senior Corbyn ally told me Corbyn's slow-motion collapse encapsulated that of the movement. The relationships within the leader's office had started to crumble over Brexit, anti-Semitism, communications and strategy. It was all beginning to fall apart, which sets up the chapter 8. I don't think it's the final chapter, is it? It's the second to last chapter. Not. Which is titled "The Blizzard of Lies and Excuses."
A quote, literally. If you want to know what a factional account this book is, like as in within factions within the left, that chapter is literally named after a line from Andrew Fisher's highly fucking like office politics partisan resignation letter. Like, if you want to know what side Owen's on, like, literally working the Fisher resignation letter into the chapter, but this bit probably give you an indication.
Yeah, but this bit does cover the European election and Len McCluskey's position, which was that it was a red herring and turnout was 37.2%, which he was right.
Len was right.
The result could never be replicated in a general election because turnout is different and electorates are more bothered, and
Some people give Len McCluskey criticism, but I'm going to have to agree with my man Owen Jones that he is the greatest union leader alive in this country.
Yeah, and so there's a line here that I think is pretty interesting, and the question that I wrote in my note is, whose fault was this? Which is, Corbyn's team were, as one aide put it, fucking exhausted, ground down by 4 years of interminable internal and external conflict. Like, whose fault is...
We haven't heard of the external conflict since, like, fucking chapter 3. But, yeah, sorry, I'm getting frustrated with the book now.
We made it quite far,
Comradely criticism.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I don't think Corbyn's team were the ones instigating a lot of this conflict. It doesn't strike me, even from this account, that his team was causing a lot of this conflict.
Yeah, should we return? I mean, some of them were. Should we maybe return to the Milne issue for a second?
Sure.
So I've seen, I was very surprised because in Owen Jones' articles while Corbyn was leader, he always described Milne as unfairly maligned or, unjustly vilified. So when George Eaton announced in his interview with Owen Jones in advance of this book that Milne comes in for a lot of criticism in the book, I was kind of surprised. I thought, I was even more surprised by every other piece on the book reiterating how critical it is of Milne when Owen became furious at New Socialist for running a piece critical of Andrew Fisher, Milne's factional opponent within the leader's office, which he said was uncomradely. And Fisher, just a mere advisor to Corbyn, like Seamus Milne was by that point, did not deserve to carry the can for this. So that's why I think it's a highly partisan book that very much expects you to take a side in matters of office politics that most people won't have any first-hand account of and will just simply have to go by the accounts given by Owen Jones, Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund for their information. And so I did a bit of digging. Like, Owen interviewed like 300 people on this. Like I say, he knows like everyone on the left. I'm not as well connected, but I do know a couple of people who worked for Corbyn. So I asked around, and a couple of sources said that in defense of what Owen is saying, Seamus Milne was not a very good manager. He wasn't good at like kind of running the overall operation and keeping people coordinated and so on like that. But he was pretty much like the best guy that the party could conceivably have had on the matters of strategy and being a political advisor. When it came to being like one of the key, obviously Andrew Fisher, it could be argued, was this as well, because he actually wrote the manifestos. But when it came to being one of the key, basically one of the key kind of like intellectual heft, the key bringers of intellectual heft behind the Corbyn project, I think Seamus Milne was like absolutely pivotal. But it's true that he had his flaws. He wasn't the best at dealing with the lobby, for example. And I think there's an argument that, yeah, maybe like one of his closest allies, James Schneider, should have taken over as like head of comms or something, which he did a lot of and was widely considered, including by Owen Jones, to be very competent at. There definitely were some people who are widely considered extremely competent who were working for Corbyn at one point or another. But I think Seamus Milne was actually pivotal to the whole operation, and maybe shouldn't carry the can to the extent that he has. Because at the very least, he's somebody who throughout the Corbyn tenure seemed to kind of hold their nerve, who seemed to not be prone to kind of being rash. And, I don't know. And basically didn't melt at any point.
Yeah.
Essentially stood steadfast. And you can say the same about Kerry Murphy.
Speaking about melting, there is the point about when they tried to abolish Tom Watson, which was a completely based move, and they should have followed through with it, because you do end up with this a surprisingly decent comeback from Watson when he sees Landsman across the road yelling the hitman that missed, which is kind of unfortunate. It's unfortunately a good line, and you've got to issuing a correction on my previous statement. You don't got to hand it to him, but
Tom Watson.
But just for the sake of that not happening, you should have followed through, I think. Because imagine getting dunked on by Tom Watson successfully. I mean, what an absolute disgrace. But Jeremy Corbyn's position was that he didn't want to abolish positions just because he didn't like the person in the post.
Yeah. I think ultimately Corbyn is kind of very principled, and he thought that I think he had misgivings about what a kind of bit of skullduggery that was, a bit just like backroom fixes and shit isn't his kind of thing.
Too much intrigue, really.
Yeah. I think it probably he would have been happy to get rid of Tom Watson, but he didn't particularly like that way of doing it. I don't know. This was kind of one of the things that led to Kerry Murphy being demoted, wasn't it?
Yes, because actually this is what happens, which is that Kerry Murphy gets... There's this meeting where Jeremy, from the description, apparently probably doesn't want to do it, because McDonnell and Abbott are in the room with him, if I remember correctly. And Diane Abbott features suspiciously little in this entire thing.
Yeah, she's barely in it. And maybe she refused to give Owen any quotes because her own biography is coming out, and she wanted them to have exclusives.
Well, I don't want to speculate too much, but maybe. They demote Kerry Murphy, they don't call it a demotion. They let her keep the title, but they move her to the party HQ, where she takes a team of people with her, as you would probably expect, and they bring in McDonnell recommended hire, which is not necessarily bad, but it's as Owen puts it, now it was McDonnell in the driving seat, which I think explains why after the election he came out and said, "Well, it's on me because he's the one who." Which, by the way, was a completely fair thing, I think, based on this account for him to say.
John McDonnell is an infallible genius. He with his brilliant triangulations and appeal to people who don't think Tony Blair was a war criminal and so on, which must be like 2% of the population because Blair's incredibly hated. I think that McDonnell really he got us the parliamentary majority that we are now enjoying in the 2019 general election, the greatest campaign of all time. I feel people on the hard left who say that he shouldn't be sitting down for pally interviews with Alistair Campbell like Owen Jones also did, are unfairly maligning him and are, what was it Owen called them? Like demented or something?
I don't know.
Anyway, look, McDonnell, as I said earlier, his role in Corbynism, at least the early period, and his pre-2015 work mean that his legacy should be secure as a great figure of the left. What I object to is the way in which his reputation is laundered in this book, whilst Corbyn's is just eviscerated. Yeah. Corbyn takes an absolute pasting, and like I say, is not written about in the reverent terms of McDonnell. The most successful left-wing politician in our country's history is belittled just to absolutely, I think, pretty rank degrees.
Yeah, I'm specifically not reading some of the specific descriptions of Corbyn because they're quite tough to read, actually, in some cases. Like, it's tough to read these sorts of things, especially in the final chapter, which, Things Fall Apart is the final chapter, which I think is an apt summary of what happened.
One of Corbyn's favourite books.
Yeah,
a novel.
It is a very good novel. And as I've proven by the stream, I can in fact read, so we can put that rumour to bed. Thank you, everyone. We can put the rumour to bed now. I did that. One of the interesting things in Shade of Darkness, yes, because Clement Attlee does not count as left wing because he was from the Labour right and was an imperialist.
That's what I'm saying. No, seriously, surely people know what I mean. Like, of the radical left, like, of the Labour left, of that faction. Nye Bevan, had he been leader of the party instead of Attlee, he would have counted, but Attlee doesn't.
Yeah. And so one of the things was that they actually do use focus groups still, even under the horrible Mr. Corbyn's terrible leadership. They did use the focus groups. And I wish they'd gone with this message, sod Brexit, rebuild Britain instead. That actually would have been a good slogan instead of the one that they came out with. But
what was their one? It was like it's time for
real
now.
Change. It's real politics now, that's right. But they tried desperately not to have for the many, not the few as their slogan because they thought it was tired and old and the moment had passed, and perhaps they were right to an extent.
All those arseholes had made all those terrible for the many, not the Jew jokes as well.
Yeah.
The worst joke of all time. Fuck people who say that.
Yeah. Also, end participation. Does Owen Jones go in on the membership in the book? He doesn't really.
No. This is what I was saying. It's the story of a movement in which the movement has like a cameo. It's pretty. I feel like. So I mentioned earlier that John McDonnell especially was making big compromises on party democracy. He intervened to protect Diana Johnson from her CLP. He endorsed Liam Byrne, arch right-wing shithead, for the Birmingham mayoral selection. And indeed, there were genuine efforts that were happening outside of the leadership office, the leader's office rather, in the grassroots to deselect their MPs, to bring radical motions to conference that barely get a look in. And in some cases, it's just very convenient for Owen Jones's arguments not to mention, say, not to get into at least, he might mention it in passing, the very good reasons that Luciana Berger's CLP had to have no confidence in her. Although that vote never happened because of pressure from the media, she had refused to confirm that she would be defecting to a new party, which, I don't know, seems like a kind of thing that would make you doubt your MP's commitment to the job that you've elected them to do. Likewise, I don't think it would suit his argument where he says how principled Luciana Berger is, and what a tragedy the party losing her was, with the fact that she now works for Edelman, the same PR company that Chuka Umunna now works for, who does Chuka's new job does get a mention in a book, but his fellow Labour right defector colleague, who has the same politics as him and defected to and took a job at the same corrupt PR company who have represented things like the Keystone XL pipeline on the same day. Also took that job. That's the kind of careful elision and omission that I think marks this book and its arguments. So like going back to like party democracy, no, the members of the movement get very little of a look in, except really when Owen defends the party's pivot to Remain by pointing out that the members had all...
Oh no. There it is. Happened again, everyone. Mr. Seamus Milne got us again. Sorry, Jack. Happened again.
That's all right. Probably my turn next.
Yeah, the CIA got me. They got me again.
Yeah, no, of course this didn't happen overnight. There was a concerted effort to make this that way, you know. And yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Party democracy doesn't get too much of a look in, because again, I think he talks about McDonnell's red lines, and I don't think party democracy is one of those. I think if I think John McDonnell and Owen seem to both, I think they both would probably be happy with a bunch of very right-wing MPs implementing a bread and butter social democratic economic program that's still imperialist, in which the party members are still marginalized. As long as those economic policies were there. I frankly think, so the book, essentially, one of many characteristics it shares with Pogren and Maguire's Left Out is that it basically posits this dichotomy between John McDonnell, who is concerned with, in Pogren and Maguire's words, the liberation of the British working class, and Jeremy Corbyn, who's more concerned with, hippy-dippy shit like Palestine, Latin America, all that bollocks in those made-up countries that don't exist. That kind of thing. And I think that's just such a false binary. Socialism should be, a joined up perspective that includes human rights around the globe and economic and social justice at home. And again, it's just the kind of this idea that you can sacrifice the radicalism, the anti-imperialism, and that's a bargain worth making, and that works as well. Because, again, elsewhere, Owen says McDonnell saw his role as defending Corbyn. He didn't do a good job, because when he did stuff like he went out and he talked tough about Russia, or he said, we should let Alistair Campbell back into the party, what did that do? That basically legitimize the idea that, look, even Corbyn's closest guy doesn't agree with him.
Yeah.
What an arsehole Corbyn is, that he can't even get John McDonnell to agree with him.
I remember it was a big news story over and over again that this rift existed between them. Now, it may well be the case, according to this, that was a bit more factual, but the fact the story was in there, and the public figure most closely associated with Jeremy Corbyn was John McDonnell. And so if you keep having these stories out there about rifts between offices and all of this stuff, well, it doesn't work. It renders it a non-viable project in a lot of ways. And then he does talk about the general election campaign in this chapter, because of course this is the big event, if you like. And he does mention that the BBC, every single error made by the BBC favoured the Conservative Party, which is something I went off about in one of my Discord chats, which was, doesn't that imply an institutional problem when all the mistakes happen to be the same one? But he doesn't quite step to that level of criticism of it.
No, he doesn't. I mean, I think there's some useful stuff in that account of the BBC's bias in favour of the Tories during the election. Again, like, Owen is one of the few journalists who is prepared to some extent criticise his peers unless they're broadly liberal and don't work for the state broadcaster, apparently, unless they're also at The Guardian. But, no, I mean, the account of the election is kind of interesting in that it doesn't mention stuff like... it talks about the disunity of the team, but of course, because Andrew Fisher is portrayed as this arch-professional, the stuff that's in Left Out about how he would just babyishly refuse to share information such as the manifesto or the grid in advance with Seamus Milne, just because of his personal animosity. That just somehow doesn't get a look in. And it's never implied that, say, that this letter, the people who, it definitely seems to be like the people who really hated Seamus Milne and were trying to topple him. Whatever Seamus Milne's virtues, like managerially, I think that the people who behaved really disgracefully in terms of constantly leaking to the press were mainly the people who were against him. And that's why that's one of the reasons why this kind of narrative about him and Kerry Murphy fucking everything up has been able to solidify.
Yeah, I was just reading some of the slightly harder hitting passages just on a personal level. So there's a bit where Corbyn sat in a cafe with his social media manager, and Corbyn is keenly aware that at this point it appears Corbyn is keenly aware that the election is lost at this point. And he's in a cafe, and he's described as being, not wanting to confront the point, but it sounds like he confronts it quite directly when he sees his terrible personal poll ratings, and he looks at him and says, "Why do you think that is?" And and then there's the very last bit, which I will read in full because it's just kind of, well, not the very last bit, but is it the very last bit? Not quite, but it's sort of the bit just at the just when the exit poll comes out. And there was just silence. Then from Corbyn, "Oh dear," and his little grandson hugged him, asking, "Are you all right?" And he whispered back, "Some days aren't good, but we'll get through it," and just walked out of the room. And then he tried to crack a joke, which was, "I'm going to ask for a full recount," which I think is...
I think that was a joke. It's evil Stalinist Corbyn.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
What was somebody asking if I was being sarcastic about, by the way?
Oh, it was the bit where you were really pro McDonnell, like how much of a saviour he was in our big Labour majority that we were enjoying.
I was being sarcastic there, yes, as you can see, as you can probably guess now.
Yeah. But it's just devastating personal bits in there. But I don't know. It felt like some of this stuff about Corbyn that's in there felt distasteful to include it to me.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It did definitely.
I don't quite know how to articulate the specific. It just doesn't sit right with me to include some of these bits.
Yeah, some kind of speculation about his health and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
All this, just very personal stuff about how diminished he was as a person and stuff. I think it's pretty gross, to be honest. I don't think it should be out. It should be something you're putting in your book.
Some of these passages are genuinely quite tough to read, and it's tough to read about how someone's health was weaponized against them in that way politically. It's true that did happen. There was a big rumor around that he'd had a stroke, if you recall, because of his new glasses. Fucking Tom Howard or some dipshit like that was like, he's had a stroke, that's why he's got new glasses that do this thing. It turned out he did have a stress-related condition that occurred in his eye. I don't know. It's just this bit is a tough read, I think. Just on a personal level. Yeah,
definitely.
Especially because for someone who I respect Corbyn and his politics, and obviously, and so it's a tough read.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I kind of think the bit you talked about where he's sitting with an aide and they ask him, "Why do you think?" Or does he ask, "Why do you think your personal ratings are like that?"
Corbyn sees the personal ratings and he asks his social media manager, "Why do you think that is?"
It's the thing is, it had hardly anything to do with the person he actually was.
I think he felt like it was that because of the nature of the criticism that he'd suffered up until that point.
You go on the fucking Labour doorstep, and the stuff people come out with about Corbyn, it's just fake news, man. But so many people have just absorbed just this bollocks. If you just make the bollocks talking points the ones that are repeated the most, then they'll penetrate eventually. We've talked about how conflict averse and stuff he is. Well, most people, not most people, but some people thought he was like a dictator in waiting. Just insane. It had nothing to do with reality. What could he do about what the fuck could he possibly do? Reiterate his commitment to democracy and peace? He does that every fucking day.
Like Palpatine in Star Wars. I love democracy. Like, is that what they wanted from him? Because
no, I mean it is crushing the way that they could, take somebody like Jeremy Corbyn, just a fundamentally decent person, and just like destroy not just his reputation, but by accounts including Owen Jones's, his personal well-being like that. When what Corbyn was actually about is stuff that people should by any means like. Really, if people sat down with Corbyn, they got to know him, he told them what he actually believed in, they'd be like, yeah, that's actually quite good,
And so after that final chapter, we do have his conclusion where he talks to Mandelson, and Mandelson has this ridiculous quote where he says both Ed Miliband and Jeremy Corbyn had turned Labour's winning machine into a sort of clapped out Ford Cortina. My note here is, what about Gordon Brown, who lost 97 fucking seats? Like,
of course, Mandy was brought back to work on that campaign, so I think, he's got that one from you. That's part of the election winning machine.
Yeah, and then there's the other part, which is where he says that Seamus Milne has much to answer for, and my note here is, does he really? I don't see how that follows from a lot of the account that Owen gives in the book. And then
Andrew Fisher, however, has nothing to answer for. Niall Suku, who, according to people close to Corbyn and close to Seamus Milne, leaked Andrew Fisher's resignation letter with the sole fucking purpose of claiming Milne's head. He has nothing to answer for. Just the guy who stayed loyal to Jeremy the entire time and never fucking briefed against the leadership.
And then, of course, there's his real, what is his real conclusion here, to me, is nonetheless it is a tragedy for the left that John McDonnell, the Labour left's natural figurehead, never assumed the leadership. And I'm like,
it just comes out of nowhere. Bollocks.
My note here is it? I don't know that it is. Of course, and he goes into the counterfactuals, and to be fair to him, he admits that it's a counterfactual that he can't properly.
Could never have happened.
Well, not even that it could never have happened. He doesn't know that it could have happened. He doesn't know that it would have worked, which I think is a fair admission if you're positing a counterfactual. But it jarred with the narrative, with the flow of this whole thing.
Yeah, and that's what I'm talking about. Some of the writing is a bit shoddy, I think, just like out of nowhere. John McDonnell is still like just the genius, like just comes out of fucking nowhere in what's supposed to be a conclusion that like sums up, I don't know,
and I think
the challenges.
And I think there's an element of this that dates when this was written or sent off to the publisher, because he talks about Keir Starmer as, holding to the 10 pledges and, defending migrants' rights. I think this dates it. That's not his fault, to be fair.
He could have written that yesterday, to be fair. Like, but Owen still thinks that the 10 pledges are an actual thing. Like, apparently, judging by the way he talks about Starmerism. I mean, yeah, that's the fundamental thing. Like, I guess you could say he's not well connected to the right, because quite rightly he has pissed them off and they all hate them, and that you can posit in Owen's defense. But like, that one of the reasons I kind of prefer the Rupert Murdoch Times writer's book on Corbynism to this one, is that you do get more of an account of the wrecking, more of an account of what the fucking bastards were doing behind the scenes to bring Corbynism down. So I don't think was quite as down to the incompetence of Seamus Milne as Owen's book makes out, but maybe that was a factor. I don't know, but
Distinguished This asks, does Owen Jones ever say what he thinks McDonnell would have brought to the table that Corbyn didn't/couldn't? I actually have the passage right here. I will read the passage about McDonnell. McDonnell is one of the most impressive post-war Labour figures, a working-class autodidact. By the way, there's not much I disagree with here. Just one of the few genuine intellects in politics, and someone who understood that the left needed to be serious and focused on winning the prize, securing power in order to transform society and overcome injustice. He will remain Labour's lost leader.
Yeah, remain being the operative fucking word.
I emphasised on purpose, perhaps, there a little bit, but
I hate this argument. I think it's so unprincipled. It's just basically John McDonnell went and threw Jeremy under the bus by yelling about Russia on TV and making Jeremy look weak. John McDonnell defended fucking Margaret Hodge, thought we shouldn't suspend Alistair Campbell from a party. John McDonnell basically persuaded Melt MPs to stay in the party so they could go on to become extremely right-wing ministers for Keir Starmer. Such great agile strategy that clearly did the left so much good and definitely didn't contradict the stated strategies of our elected leader, who was a guy called Jeremy Corbyn, not John McDonnell. He may be Labour's great lost leader, but if you're to believe Diane Abbott amongst other people, John McDonnell could never quite accept that he was not Labour's great leader, full stop.
And can I just point out that throughout the book, Owen frames John McDonnell and frames this instinct. I think what he means by securing power specifically, he keeps saying that John McDonnell wanted to avoid unnecessary conflicts and fights and stuff like that. And the problem with that is people will make fights for you, right? As we found out. We found out over the past 4 or 5 years, people will manufacture fights for you to have to deal with. There is no unavoidable fight, especially if you're standing by principles,
Yeah, well, when obviously one of the biggest examples they use of an unavoidable fight is the IHRA definition. I'm sorry, but I don't think that defending the Palestinians from racism is an avoidable fight. I think that those examples were wrong, and that frankly the idea that there was anything racist about trying to change them is a grotesque mischaracterization. And I don't buy Owen's idea that Labour didn't have a moral currency. They did by the virtue of the fact they stood up for that. That showed a greater level of moral courage. I don't know what moral fucking currency is, in this context, but that is something that you can't easily dodge. And as you say, Sinan, this shit just doesn't happen naturally. Crises are created. And whether or not Seamus Milne had written a dynamite press release about that mural, that would not have stopped the Daily Mail from running a new story every Sunday about how in 2011 Corbyn stood next to a person with brown skin.
Yeah. And as people point, so someone has said, what about the whole Mal Red Book incident? If McDonnell was leader, he would have been monstered, surely. Yeah,
exactly.
Of course.
There would have been IRA would have become the anti-Semitism.
By the way, can I say,
era.
if you were wondering about IRA, McDonnell has a much more difficult relationship there than Jeremy Corbyn ever did. I mean, the guy's nickname was the Quartermaster, so which is a badass nickname, but. And
also, people come up with this reductive thing like McDonnell only cared about economic justice and Corbyn only cared about foreign policy. That's kind of, maybe those were their primary interests, but McDonnell was deeply involved in pro-Palestine activism, and Corbyn was at the forefront of the anti-austerity movement. So that is in itself a reductive simplification.
So for the chat, I'll just say that there is no account, so far as I remember, of the John McDonnell Mal Book incident, which maybe implies that John did not react fantastically to it at the time.
Another convenient omission,
Yeah, I mean, I was just reminded of it, and I'm like, oh yeah, there was no bit. And that was kind of a big deal at the time. I remember thinking how awesome it was. My mum was famously Maoist mum was like, hell yeah, that fucking rules.
Sorry, are we supposed to be still fucking stewing that Jeremy Corbyn didn't sing the national anthem because we think that the average voter is so thick that they can't understand that some people don't like the national anthem? Owen apparently thinks that is an impossible idea to communicate. Are we still supposed to be stewing about that, but not saying, oh, that was so terrible when McDonnell threw Mal's Red Book?
That's why we have the Maldonnell emote in the chat, but people are demanding I remove it after this review. So
wow, yeah, I mean yeah. I'm trying to go in like Diane Abbott when she attacks people. I'm trying to be like, I've got endless respect for John McDonnell. But the man's a fucking sellout, that kind of thing. Look,
I did love Diane Abbott destroying Keir. That was
That was great.
That
Yeah.
was so good.
Look, I think McDonald's motivations
yeah.
could have been as pure as for Driven Snow, but it's a failed strategy. And if you're writing a strategy book, which this is more than a history book, then you should pretty much acknowledge that it was every bit the failure that the Jeremy Corbyn operation.
Which, by the way, John McDonnell acknowledged himself in an interview after the election.
I think, like Andy Burnham relative to some of the people who worked on his campaign, John McDonnell would be a lot more circumspect about some of the shit he did these last few years than a lot of his defenders would be.
Mm. And unless anyone has any more questions, I think we've more or less reached the end of it. At long last, that lasted longer than I thought, but it was really good. So,
well, yeah, we went on.
Yeah, I think my partner will be annoyed if we carry on much longer because she's trying to go to sleep. So,
I just do one last look through the notes to see if there's anything major we've missed.
We'll wrap up at 10.
Yeah, that's cool. I think 5 minutes or so is pretty much good. I mean, one thing I think that alright, so I keep the billionth fucking convenient elision that I've noticed in this book is the way that, and Owen does this elsewhere, is the way that he always says, I voted for Corbyn in 2015 and campaigned for him in 2016. I campaigned for Corbyn in 2015 and voted for him in 2016 because, of course, there wasn't a campaign in 2016. and again, this is what I'm saying about Owen's perspective. It is both too close and at this distance that he's clearly kind of uncomfortable with, like, because he didn't take that job, he spent like 5 years just really like resenting that they weren't making the strategic calls that he would have done, just being on the outside but still inside enough to be privy to everything that was happening. And it's always just completely warped his perspective, as has the foot that he has in the door of the media. I mean, Owen was freaking out about, bad office management and shit and a poor media strategy, which again, he had no solutions to himself. When the rest of us were just happy to have a socialist leader. When Paul Mason saw the coup that was happening against Corbyn as outrageous and fundamentally undemocratic, Owen he was so worried, Seamus isn't good enough about dealing with the lobby or some trivial Westminster shite like that he couldn't get on the campaign trail to support Corbyn. He wasn't at any of the stumps. And thanks for letting Paul Mason walk into that position on the left, by the way, Owen. That worked out well. But it's really, I think this is an example of like an account of Corbynism that is just detached from the movement, that is not versed in like the concerns of the ordinary Corbyn supporter. And ultimately, I think its conclusion fails because basically Owen's so hesitant to criticize Starmer. And the book has not laid the groundwork by talking about, and this may be in part because he's not very connected with the right of the party, but talking about the groundwork that was laid for what would become Starmerism. And that's what the left needs right now. It needs a full-throated defense of Corbynism, which was, I think, if you're on the left, an exceptionally positive thing to occur in British politics, whatever its flaws, better than anything else comparable, of which there is very little. And, there needs to be a proper defense of that, which I'm so disappointed there wasn't more of in this book. But also there needs to be an account of what Starmerism is and how it represents a counter-revolution by the forces that brought down Corbynism and worked at every stage to stymie it. And that's why I'm very disappointed by the stance Owen has taken to the Keir Starmer leadership, which conned the members with a supposedly left-wing agenda and is now pursuing an outright right-wing pro-establishment one. And he's just going on pretending that it's Labour as usual, that it's nice, soft left social democracy, and that there's a good continuity from Corbynism, and I think that this is dishonest. This doesn't tell you what's happening, because it still seems that he's kind of holding his judgment on this new leadership. Whereas I think you can absolutely see what they are, and you can't talk about Corbynism without acknowledging, as frankly I think the Pogrund and Maguire book does better, how it was able to generate such an intense shift back to the right in response to it. But of course, he doesn't acknowledge that this is an intense shift back to the right, and that the kind of neoliberal politics of compromise that he condemns as bound to fail in his book is what we're currently seeing from Starmer.
Yeah, that is kind of the disconnect, which is where his final conclusion. His conclusion is titled "The Centre Can't Hold," which I think is an accurate description of what the political landscape is going to be like, is going to continue to be for a long time, because we're entering into, as he points out, a period of great uncertainty and crisis. And I think I don't know why I understand why, as a pro-Labour columnist who has a significant profile, he feels maybe uncomfortable passing judgment on Keir Starmer. I'm being the melt and the compromiser here by sort of understanding a little bit why he might feel uncomfortable. But
did any of his peers feel that about Corbyn?
That's right.
I don't know.
That's exactly what I was getting to, which is he acknowledges throughout that the press behaves like a partisan actor on behalf of the Conservative Party. He is not, and we know he's not unaware of the partisan nature of the British press across the board. He is keenly aware of it. He gets in trouble for pointing it out. So why doesn't he... I understand why he personally, and it's almost like he's kind of a reflection of Corbyn in the press, where he feels uncomfortable confronting in this way, this difficult issue, because Starmerism is difficult to confront, and it's going to be difficult to confront, and we're going to have to confront it. In fact, if you guys enjoyed this, you will see me and 4 other people confront it tomorrow from 7, where we'll be celebrating 202 days of Keir Starmer's leadership by relentlessly dunking on him.
Number.
Yeah, because I stream on specific days, but Kirill 202 Opposition Not Found is the title, and so we'll be enjoying that. But yeah, it's just, I don't know. That feels like I don't know Owen Jones that well. So I don't know that I can pass a particular personal judgment on him. But it feels like he's aware of what's going on, but feels unable to do anything, despite having a significant platform, which I find strange.
Yeah. I don't get it. Well, I don't get why one of the weekly columns can't just be like, look, Starmer is pursuing clearly a right-wing agenda, but maybe he doesn't think that. I can't see why you wouldn't think that. But again, like, he's very he knows when not to say something. So, for example, he'll praise MPs who Starmer has sacked for breaking the whip for their courage, but not criticize Starmer for sacking them.
Yeah, like it's
like, come on, join up the dots.
Yeah, like, why did they have to resign? Come on, like,
yeah,
one step further. Anyway, I think that's our time actually. So,
should we end?
Yeah.
Can we end on a funny moment?
Sure.
A couple of Carrie Murphy anecdotes.
All right, but I will just say, if you enjoy Jack, go subscribe to Real Politics Patreon, and if you enjoyed this, follow me and subscribe to me, because I need to pay my rent.
Anyway, do those things.
Yeah,
no, I mean, I was just gonna say, like, I think we should end on a highlight, some of the highlights of the book, which is just Carrie Murphy absolutely mullering cunts. Like, there's this bit where Andy Burnham goes to Corbyn's office during the 2016 coup with a delegation of MPs who are allies of his to resign. You'll remember that Burnham did not resign. You'll be thinking, wait, I don't remember that happening. And that would be because Kerry Murphy locked Corbyn in his office, went out, allegedly, locked Corbyn in his office, went out, cornered Burnham and co in the corridor and just said, how fucking dare you, and just bollocked them into not resigning until they just kind of slunked off in the cowardly jellyfish that Burnham and Co are. Oh, and the other one would be where she basically called Clive Lewis up when Owen Jones was, as he does mention in this book, stupidly trying to like tout Clive Lewis as some kind of replacement for Corbyn. Kerry Murphy apparently called Clive Lewis up and was just like, Clive, you need to wind your fucking neck in. He was like, Clive, tell Owen to wind his fucking neck in, or else we're going to think that you're telling him to do this.
There's also a bit where, I don't know if it's Kerry Murphy, where they said, one day you're going to be leader and I'm going to run that campaign, but it's not this one.
Yeah. Like... and I like the bit as well where Corbyn says about Chris Williamson, like that absolute
idiot, like...
what a complete idiot. Why can't he shut the fuck up?
Yeah, like what's he fucking I think it was what's he fucking said. Like
that was Ken Livingstone.
Oh, that
Corbyn
was Ken Livingstone, yeah.
The only time Corbyn's quoted as swearing is when Ken Livingstone and Chris Williamson were massive dickheads.
So that does tell you that there are some fun anecdotes in here. They may not be exclusive to this. It's not a horrible book. I think it's worth reading if you feel like reading it. It's more of a, I think once everything's said and done and everything's been put out, this is more of a full completion as opposed to an essential text. But
I think you expect more than the gossipy, trivial style from a major figure of the left like Owen Jones. To be honest, I'm disappointed. I don't think this is the book that people needed. People in the movement. I'm not even entirely sure who it's for, to be quite honest, because it seems to awkwardly shift between pitching itself to Corbynites and non-Corbynites alike. And I don't think that the last few years that it salvages the politics of the last few years to just chalk it up to the incompetence of a couple of people.
Yeah.
I think I don't think Owen repeatedly says it's defeatist to say we could never win. I wouldn't quite say we could never have won, but it's not defeatist, it's realist to acknowledge how immensely stacked the deck was against us.
Yes, and Jamtaput has asked us for ratings out of 10. I'll give it a solid 7, as Corbyn did for the EU. I didn't think it was an unenjoyable read. I didn't think that it was a complete, disaster. I just disagreed with aspects of it, and I think that's fine. And I don't think that reflects poorly on Owen necessarily. It's just a 7 from me. I would, it was worth reading, I think, for especially for this, where we got to talk about it.
I'm not sure if I should do a Keir and abstain, because I'm not going to have anything. I'm not going to have a positive rating to give this book. I think it's a 3 or a 4.
Okay, well, there you go. Now you guys get why we spoke about it in such different terms, I guess.
Yeah.
But it's good. It's good that we had that discussion and conversation. I
thought we seemed in tune on quite a lot of it.
Yeah, again, it's kind of like the EU, where the difference between 4 and 7 is probably not that big. Anyway, guys, it's good night from me, because I'm winding up my partner, I suspect, by talking so loudly. So it's good night from me.
Right. Good, and night from me as well. Thanks for having me on, Sinan.
No worries, mate. See you, chat. You'll catch me tomorrow from 7. Good night.